Ladies and gentlemen, today is December the 4th, 2022, and I'm going to be joined by our amazing friend, Agent Smith, where we will talk about the world, foreign policy, economics, history, current events, you name it. We'll try our best to break it down for you. This is a live conversation, so if you have questions, you can put them in the Twitch chat, and we'll do our best to pass those along and address them. Without further ado, I will jump into the voice chat with Mr. Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo. How are you doing, Sire?
Oh, I'm doing okay. How are you?
We are ballin'.
Ballin'.
Yes. Doing the first ever Neuro subathon. Are you familiar with the subathon?
I am not.
The subathon
What is it?
is like a stream that keeps on going until people stop giving. Because by subscribing or donating, they increase the timer of how long I keep my channel online.
Ah, interesting.
Yes, I've been live for 101 hours so far.
Really?
Yes. But that includes sleep.
Really?
Yes, Twitch, weirdly enough, has their own category called I'm Only Sleeping. And that's the category I set it to when I go to sleep. There's a camera on me when I'm asleep, and then I play videos from our Dungeons & Dragons campaign. So there's still stuff happening.
Ah,
Yeah. This is day 5. A lot of people were asking, they're like, is Agent Smith still going to happen? And I was like, I think so, if he's down for it. And it turns out it is happening. And there was much rejoicing in the chat, and I did have at least a dozen people ask if you were going to be on today. So we've missed you and hope you had a good Thanksgiving and stuff.
oh yeah, lots of food.
Yep.
Very fattening.
The American tradition of overeating. But yeah, I went to DreamHack Atlanta. That was the first big StarCraft LAN event in, I think, since COVID, basically.
How did it go?
It was cool. It was great seeing a lot of faces of friends that I hadn't seen since pre-COVID. And then there were some new people who are newer to the StarCraft scene who were also hanging out. And there was still a lot of energy and fire around the StarCraft games. They ended up having to get a bunch of extra chairs for the matches for people to watch them and stuff. So the game is still hanging on there, even though it was made like 12 years ago.
It's good to hear.
Yeah.
It sounds like fun.
Yeah. I don't know when we're going to be done with the subathon. I put a 3-week cap on it just so I don't go like through Christmas and New Year's in case I want to do something for that. But we have 47 hours on the timer, assuming no one gifts anything for the rest of it. And then for each of the different thresholds for subscriptions, I'm doing different stuff. Like I'll play Protoss some of the time. I did a guide for how I make my slow cooker meal and things like that. So it's also been a fun opportunity for me to do more variety of content than I normally do, aside from just spamming StarCraft matches and Dota matches and stuff.
Are you gonna do anything for Christmas?
Unsure. I visited my family in Oregon recently, so we aren't sure if we're going to do Christmas plans. Flights are like 5 times the cost if you're flying around Christmas time as opposed to any other time of the year.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
It's a little steep.
Yep, so we'll see about that. But I'm feeling pretty good. We got some snow here this week, which was fun. It snowed once, and then it snowed again. We had a bit of a power outage, so that was exciting. And it happened like the day before I started the subathon, so I'm glad that it hasn't interrupted the show, at least.
I remember snow.
Yeah.
I understand that is a thing that exists.
Far to the north from Texas, where Agent Smith lives.
Yeah, we don't get very much here. I think the last snow we had was probably during that big freeze. What was it, last year or so?
Oh, yeah. When all the power went out and stuff?
Yeah, yeah.
You still had power, though, if I remember right.
Yeah, we were lucky. We never lost it. Although some of that is because ERCOT, which is sort of the public-private agency responsible for energy here, either lied or misrepresented, depending on who you talk to, about how they were going to try to ration electricity.
Mm,
They had said that if somebody lost electricity, it should only be for a relatively short time, maybe a few hours. And what they would do is they would try to restore power there and then take power from somebody else so that no one, person or group of people would be subjected to just long-term lockout
mm,
power outages.
mm,
But in practice, that didn't seem to have happened, and there were lots of reports of people losing power for days, even.
mm.
So, on the one hand, that's bad, but it also means that people who did have electricity, it seems, were generally able to keep it. So, we were in the lucky group, it seems.
Mm. And what was the reason for that again? They didn't winterize their stuff, or was it the windmills?
It's those damn windmills. No. Uh, Lack of winterization was part of it, but that's also a bit of a simplification. It really had more to do with natural gas. Um, Natural gas lines were themselves not winterized. And so, because I think most of the electricity generated in Texas is generated from natural gas plants. So,
Mm,
because those lines had to be, because the natural gas lines, that is to say, had to be shut down on account of the weather, that basically just removed a huge chunk of electricity generation from the grid and really put the squeeze on us.
mm,
But yeah, there was lack of winterization of like the actual power generating equipment as well. That didn't help. But I think natural gas was sort of the bigger thing. Yeah, in other words, just winterizing electricity supplies would not be sufficient in and of itself to prevent it from happening again. You would also have to winterize natural gas infrastructure.
mm,
And I think they've done that. ERCOT says they've done it, but I think there was a report the other day saying that, well, not the other day, but the other week, that was released and covered by the Texas Tribune saying that if there were another outbreak of weather of the same type that occurred during that big freeze in 2021, we would still have a pretty similar outcome. Maybe not as bad, but we would still have power outages,
mm,
despite what efforts have been made to try to hedge against that. So that's not encouraging,
mm.
but they have at least said that it's more resilient than it was before, allegedly. So I guess that's something.
Potential progress in the Texas energy grid.
Oh, somebody. Okay. I don't normally read chat, but I just kind of had your window open here. Somebody says that El Paso was the only place not to get. El Paso, it's true, did not get any power outages, but that's because it's actually on a separate network. It's actually not part of the Texas energy network. I think it's part of whatever it is that's in the western US. It's actually technically part of that network.
Wow. They just lost a bunch of Texas credibility there.
Well, it seems to work for them.
Well,
I
we
guess I
haven't
might
done
as
Agent Smith for a bit because I've been away and stuff. What's been going on the past few weeks?
stuff. Quite a bit of stuff. Was there anything in particular you had in mind, or do you want me to just kind of move through the list here?
Well, just a quick note off the cuff. I know we usually address the war in Ukraine. Bitter Sugar is still hanging around. He's been tuning in a few times during the subathon, so he's doing fine. He recently got over just having kind of a fever illness, but he's feeling better now. He said that they
Good.
have some kind of uh, power cycling issues there where it's sometimes on, sometimes off for him. They don't have power all the time.
Mhm.
But yep, holding strong.
I'm glad to hear he's doing okay. Yeah, the weather has gotten very cold in Ukraine, and of course, electricity and the infrastructure of electricity has been subject to a weeks-long bombardment by the Russians, and it's created more than a few issues.
Hmm.
I don't think it's going to make anybody in Ukraine change their mind about supporting the war, but it's definitely having a pretty serious impact on quality of life in Ukraine right now.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think the government has responded to that. Well, besides trying to restore as much of the damaged infrastructure as they can, they've also been trying to get trying to distribute power generators, sort of like the small mobile ones that you can have in your home
Hmm.
to try to alleviate some of the pressure. And they've also set up, oh, what were they calling them? Invulnerability centers. They had some weird kitschy name for them, but basically there's these areas in a particular part of a town or a city where the government sets up a space that is heated that does have power where people can stay
Hmm.
if they're particularly vulnerable to the cold during a power outage.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a whole of government effort over there. That's pretty much what you would expect during wartime. They're trying to make the best of it, given the limited resources they have.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's good to hear he's doing well still.
Yep.
Yeah, hopefully he's staying away from Donbass. I think he was saying that his family wasn't too far away. It's been a lot of fighting there.
Yeah, I think they have a house that's over there, but he's in Kiev, which is relatively safer and more stable.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I remember he was I think he was a student. I think he was studying at a university.
Yeah, he's PhD kind of level, I think,
Yeah.
grad
Yeah, I
student.
remember him saying that during the, because we interviewed him,
Y-
like in the first, what was it, like week or two
yep.
of the war. And yeah, I remembered that he was a student because he was saying that he'd actually seen some of the aftermath from the Battle of Kiev
Hmm.
when the Russians were trying to blitz in into the city from the west. And his university actually wasn't that far, so we actually saw some of the destroyed vehicles and bodies and whatnot from the fighting that had happened along the freeway into western Kiev.
Hmm.
Pretty wild stuff.
Yep. Very
I'm glad we
surreal
were,
as a
yeah,
perspective coming from someone who's been in a country of pretty much persistent peace, at least in the mainland.
yeah, yeah. It was well, even more so given given that we were talking to him.
Hmm.
We hadn't been quite expecting something so dramatic as that, but I'm glad we were able to get that recorded and kind of save that for posterity. That's a interesting and valuable firsthand account from
Hmm.
a historical perspective.
Yep. It was a nice way to cut through the weeds of a lot of the propaganda as well, because that's one of the fog of war issues is both sides are like cranking out a ton of quote news, some of which is more accurate than other stuff, and it's really difficult to tell as a consumer of news what's legit and what's not.
Yeah. Yeah, there's quite a bit of that. I don't think the Russians are very good at it at this point, or at least if they are good at it, they're not targeting the West at this point because the stuff they've been producing has just been crazy, just like patently obvious. They're bullshitting.
Mm.
I think Sergei Lavrov did an interview a week or two ago, and he was just talking all kinds of crazy shit. Ukrainians are our brothers and they're awesome and they're Nazis and we have to destroy them. And it was just this weird bipolar screed that he went on.
Mm.
The thing about Sergei Lavrov, he's the foreign minister of Russia, right? So he's like their lead diplomat. And he's not a dumb guy, right? He's been around a long time. Like I remember reading about Lavrov. I remember reading about diplomacy involving Lavrov back when I was still in college. That was almost 20 years ago. And he was always seen as a pretty like smart, witty dude. So to see him kind of reduced to this is just weird. And it just
Mm.
kind of speaks of how bizarre the moment is at this juncture in Russia, if not in Europe generally.
Mm.
I guess we could do Ukraine. I do have some stuff on it
Sure.
since we're on the topic. But yeah, there's definitely other stuff we can talk about. I'm just not sure how much of it you've already heard about. Let's see. Oh, I've got to open. Oh, it's already open. Oh, what did we have for this week? So this is from what, past couple weeks, I guess. What was that? We did this, what, 3 weeks ago? Two
Mm-hmm.
weeks ago?
Yeah, I think 3 weeks ago.
Sounds about right. Let's see. Ah, yeah, more. Okay, we already talked about the electricity network in Ukraine getting targeted, so that's been happening. Some of that happened after the G20 meeting in Bali. There was a statement made by President Zelensky at the G20 criticizing Russia. And so after that, oh, also, this happened, that is to say, the G20 meet and Zelensky's statement there happened a couple days after the Russians retreated out of Kherson, the city, and pulled their forces away from the western bank of the Dnieper River. So the Russians may have been retaliating for that, the retreat and then Zelensky's statements. Uh, their volleys, their attempts to attack energy infrastructure have not been continuous. It's been kind of more intermittent. And there tend to be spikes whenever they feel like they need to retaliate against something that happens in Ukraine or the West or what have you. So one of those volleys happened just after G20, after the G20 meeting, that is. Oh, yeah. Did you hear about this? There was that Russian, well, there was a missile that hit eastern Poland and killed a couple people.
Yeah, I did hear about that.
Yeah, there was some excitement about that, about whether or not it had been a Russian missile and, whether that would activate, Article 5 of the NATO Charter or some such. That was never going to happen. That was just a lot of hyperventilating. Even if it had been a Russian missile, it would not have resulted in like an immediate declaration of war or some such. It was pretty readily apparent from the start that, whoever owned the missile, whoever it belonged to, had not intended, for it to strike Poland. But as was, everybody kind of assumed it was a Russian missile, like a cruise missile that had gotten knocked off course or had malfunctioned or something. But it seems it was actually a Ukrainian missile. The theory that I read was that it was a surface-to-air missile that was fired at, maybe a Russian cruise missile or Russian aircraft, and then either missed its target or malfunctioned or, otherwise suffered some kind of issue, and as a result ended up flying off over the border, and it just kind of planted itself, right next to two civilians. I think it was a house that it hit or something. I don't remember exactly. Yeah, really, it should not have been like a big deal, but of course, people online, freak out given how sensitive how sensitive the issue of potential escalation between Russia and the West is. But I think Ukraine, and specifically the Ukrainian government, kind of did not help their cause because over the course of the subsequent, investigation, there was more evidence that it was a Ukrainian missile, but the Ukrainian government insisted, even after there was evidence contrary to the fact, that it was a Russian missile. And that led to some grumbling amongst some European diplomats. They were saying that it doesn't matter if it was a Ukrainian missile, like we're not going to blame the government. We know they didn't do it on purpose. So it just kind of looked skeevy for the Ukrainian government to try to insist that it was Russian when it was clearly not. They would have preferred if they had just been honest about it. But even that didn't turn out to be an issue. People pretty much forgot about it after a week, so ended up being kind of a non-issue. Oh yeah. So this is like some foreshadowing. So have you ever heard of what's called a small diameter bomb?
No.
Well, it's exactly as the name implies. It's just a very small bomb, almost a bomblet, really. And it's designed for precision strikes. If you want to blow something up, but you don't want a lot of collateral damage, you can use this, which is just a very small bomb designed to hit a very specific target. And as we've seen with the American Ginsu knife missile, which is not its proper name, but it's what the internet kind of calls it. We've seen that missiles now can be very, very accurate. So the small diameter bomb basically just takes that accuracy and uses an explosive instead of, sharp objects. So the talk was that the United States specifically, and I think, what was it, Boeing, the company, has proposed to attach rocket motors to these bombs so that they can be used as a kind of ranged munition. Normally it's intended to be like a guided bomb. It's supposed to kind of guide itself to a target using, either GPS or laser or whatever. Uh, but in this case, instead of having it be dropped from an aircraft, it would be fired from some kind of, ground vehicle or launcher. And using this rocket motor, it would be fired up over a target area, and then it would fall and presumably strike some, specific target using the normal guidance package that is normally attached to the munition. And the idea here is to help supplement Ukrainian inventories because I don't know how close attention everybody's been paying, but one of the big topics of conversation right now amongst the analysts I've been following on Twitter and in the news and in magazines and whatnot has been ammunition supplies on both the Ukrainian and Russian sides. Russia in particular has been blowing through immense amounts of its inventory of munitions, particularly artillery shells. And Ukraine doesn't have as many weapon systems, but what they have, they've been using heavily. So they both have something of a shortage problem at this point that they're going to try to alleviate as best they can. And of course, for the Ukrainians, the big advantage they have is that they have suppliers in the West who can kind of make up for the fact that Ukraine's own industry cannot quite supply everything they need. Well, really can't really supply anywhere near everything they need. That is a big advantage, but the trouble is that before the war started, the expectation amongst Western military planners of one sort or another is that the era of mass mobilization, industrial warfare was kind of over, and that if there were a future war, it would probably be something like, a Bush war in the Middle East, like Iraq, or something like Afghanistan, basically a powerful military against low-level insurgents. And they figured if there were some kind of conflict with a major power, it would probably be relatively short and limited in scope. Maybe like a war between the US and China would probably be fought just over Taiwan and would not necessarily last all that long, depending on, certain variables. And as a result of these assumptions, basically the industrial base was allowed to atrophy. That is to say that the productive capacity of America's military industrial complex is not nearly as high as it used to be. Basically, we build up stocks of needed weapons and munitions and vehicles slowly over time, and we slowly replace old stuff that's obsolesced in the process. So that doesn't really necessitate a lot of productive capacity. You don't need a lot of surge capacity so that you can significantly ramp up production if you need, because it wasn't thought that it would ever really be needed, at least not in the short to medium term. And, every so often, history kind of proves assumptions wrong, and this is one of those times. Ukraine has showed that the era of industrial warfare is not, in fact, over, at least in certain cases. Maybe Ukraine and its war is not necessarily representative of what the future of warfare would look like, but at least lends a considerable bit of evidence that actually it is a good idea to have surge capacity. But we didn't have that, and so as a result, the West, even though it has a much bigger economy than Russia, is actually still having trouble producing enough supplies to meet all of the demand in Ukraine. And that's led to a lot of negotiating, both in the business world and in the political world about how to expand that capacity to meet this unexpected, surge in demand. And from the talk I was reading, earlier in the war and in the months since, the expectation was that the West will probably not really be able to significantly ramp up war production until the middle of 2023. Well, I should say, will not be in a position to ramp up production until mid 2023. So until then, until then, Ukraine is probably going to continue to have to ration what they get. They're not going to be able to just go full ham using all of their weapons available. They have to kind of be careful because right now we're kind of bottlenecked in terms of military production in the West. But if they can make it to mid 2023, those problems should significantly alleviate and will continue to alleviate if the war continues to beyond that, because we're starting to unveil and agree to various deals that I've read about them in like defense news and stuff. There's been agreements with production companies to start scaling up. So factories are being built, people are being hired, factories are being retooled. Like that process of significantly expanding productive capacity is in motion, but it just takes time. As anybody who's ever studied the United States experience in World War II can tell you, like ramping up production takes a while, even if you're the biggest economy on the planet. So if they can just hang on, we can help them out. But for the moment, we just kind of need some time. But anyway, that's all just background, basically, to the small diameter bomb thing. The idea with the small diameter bomb is that we can take a weapon that has been in our inventory, that is to say, in the United States inventory, and that we have a lot of, but which we hadn't really been able to give to the Ukrainians because they didn't really have the capacity to deliver it, right? They do have aircraft and whatnot that can drop bombs, but airspace over Ukraine is pretty heavily contested right now. And it's not necessarily worth it. That is to say, it's not necessarily worth risking an aircraft just to drop a single, or maybe even just a couple small diameter bombs. The calculus doesn't really work out to make it really worth the effort. But if you attach a rocket to it, then you can just, rocket it over the target area, and then you don't have to risk an aircraft. So this was kind of a new idea proposed by Boeing, and it looks like they're going to move forward with it. So they can probably get this ready also by 2020, mid 2023 or so. And they should be able to significantly ramp up deliveries of this new weapon. Because again, we've already got a lot in inventory, both the rocket motors and the bombs. So we don't necessarily have to wait around for like a new factory and stuff. We can just start giving, them these. So it'll be a couple months still. You're not going to hear about it anytime soon. But spring 2023, you'll probably be reading a lot in the news about these new weapons because they're probably going to be as impactful, or at least nearly as impactful as the HIMARS that the United States has been giving them. So it'll be a big advantage, and it'll give them a big boost in the supply of ranged munitions that they can bring to bear against the Russians, and it'll help alleviate that bottleneck in supply that they've been experiencing. So again, nothing happening now, but keep an eye on this space. This will be something that is going to be bigger news next year.
Well, it makes sense. You don't want to have a ton of idle production, basically. So for the Western nations to not have just a ton of active productive capacity is like efficient from a money standpoint.
Yeah.
We
Yeah, that
use
was the issue.
StarCraft terms in that sense of you want to build exactly the amount of production for what you need to be making in the immediate term. You don't want to like overproduce your production facilities and just have them sitting there because they take up space and they're pretty expensive to build.
Yeah, one of the big problems in the business industry, one of the big problems that businesses in the weapons manufacturing industry have had is that they are willing and happy to increase production to meet all of this demand from Ukraine, but they want to make sure that they can get a contract with the U.S. government to ensure that if they do invest in this new productive capacity, that they're not going to end up getting screwed. Like if the war, if something happens and the war ends earlier than expected, before that productive capacity can significantly be used, then they're going to be stuck with a big bill for these new factories, which will not be able to pay for themselves. And that, of course, will blow a big hole in their balance sheet. So even though they're, happy to invest and whatnot, they just want to make sure that all of their bases are covered. And so they've been kind of haggling with the U.S. government over terms and prices and, guarantees and whatnot to ensure they don't get burned. But that's getting worked out from what I've read. They are making progress. It's just slower than you would like it to be. One would like to think they could hash that out very quickly, but unfortunately, that's just not the speed of business, if you like. Certainly not business involving the government.
Hmm. When's the last time the military industrial complex got another big kind of awakening or boost? Would it have been 9/11 and Iraq War?
Yeah, that's what I would go with. Because, the budget got gutted after the Cold War ended. That was the big peace dividend. And for a long time, it was still high. I mean, they still made, they were still given several $100 billion, but it was a significant cut from what they've been getting, at the end of the Cold War. And it wasn't nearly enough to do all of the stuff they were being asked to do, certainly. So they had to make a lot of sacrifices. So then 9/11 happens, and the budget just skyrockets. All of a sudden they're getting everything they need. Um, a lot of that was kind of just going to fund the wars, like in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it wasn't necessarily being used in the wisest way, like in terms of improving things like training facilities, modernizing bases, investing in new equipment, that kind of stuff. But they were significantly upscaling, like personnel, getting more people. There was, I don't know how many people remember reading about the war in Iraq back in the day. I think we have an older audience, so probably most of you do. But one of the big issues in the U.S. Army in particular during the war was that they just had chronic shortages of personnel. Like they were always having to do, what were they called? Normally you're only supposed to do like one tour, and then you're supposed to get a break and go home, and then after that they can bring you back for another tour, if you're up for it. Stop loss, I think that's what they ended up doing a lot of what was called stop loss, where basically you don't get the break. Basically, you go on one tour, and then when it's supposed to finish, they just say, "Hey, we don't have enough people, so we're going to make you go on another tour." That was especially difficult for a lot of people, as I recall, who were reservists and in the National Guard, because those are kind of more supposed to be used for emergencies, not really long-term deployments, but in effect, a lot of them ended up getting used like that, and it kind of disrupted a lot of people's plans. So that was one of the big deals at that time. So one of the ways that the government tried to deal with that is by significantly increasing funds to, recruit new people, which of course was challenging.
Mm-hmm.
you know, People kind of saw what was going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a lot of people were a little hesitant to jump in, understandably so. It was a little easier, like immediately after 9/11, there was actually like a big surge in recruiting in the immediate aftermath, for obvious reasons. People felt like they were under attack and they wanted to kind of, do their part to try to do something about it. But then a lot of goodwill was lost, I think, with Iraq. Not immediately, but like in the year or so afterwards, it was pretty clear that the government had kind of been bullshitting people and that there wasn't a lot of tie-in with Al Qaeda, like people had been saying. And so, yeah, after that, that sort of post 9/11 moment of clarity, moment of unity, if you like, that kind of withered pretty quickly after that.
Mm.
But yeah, it's a lot of money was spent on the military after 9/11. I would say that, yeah, to answer your question, that was probably the last time that it was significantly scaled up. It never really fell all that much. Like even after the U.S. pulled out of Iraq, it's not as though the budget was like gutted or anything. Probably the biggest cuts were accidental. I don't know how many people remember the what was it called? Sequestration, I believe it was. I don't know how many people remember that, but that was like this moment of stupidity in the U.S. government. Uh, everybody kind of remembers that, every so often there's a big standoff in the United States federal government over the federal budget. And there's a lot of grandstanding and threats about shutting down the government if there's not cuts to the budget and, all this kind of thing. And so to try to avoid that, there was this agreement made, and it was called sequestration. And the idea was that if they could not agree on a bipartisan consensus budget, then there would be this other budget that they had drawn up that would be painful for everybody. And the idea was that it would be so unlikable and painful for both Democrats and Republicans that it would act as an incentive to basically force them to negotiate an actual consensus budget to try to get around all the partisan gridlock. So you can probably guess what happened. They failed to reach an agreement, and the shit agreement immediately went into effect. And the result was pretty significant cuts to, well, relatively significant cuts to the military as well as to welfare agencies and, all manner of stuff. The sacred cows, basically, that were not supposed to be touched ended up getting touched. I wonder sometimes if they didn't do that on purpose, just so that they can make cuts without kind of getting blamed for it by their key constituents. But that's speculation on my part. Regardless, I think those were the biggest cuts to the military after 9/11. But they've remained relatively stagnant since then, relatively speaking. Obviously, competition. Well, when Trump won and the Trump administration started up, they pushed hard for a big increase to the military budget, but it wasn't like post 9/11 levels of increase. It was a notable increase in budget, but not like massive. And they still weren't, they're still not really getting enough money to do all of the stuff that Congress wants them to do. Congress keeps talking about, competing with China, containing the Middle East, helping Europe, containing Russia and Europe. And the military still kind of struggles to do all of that stuff. Congress talks about like, well, the Navy talks about, what was it, a 400 ship Navy. I think that's what it was. And then Congress kind of agrees that, yeah, that's a good idea, and then just sort of refuses to fund all of it. So there's a lot of haggling on that count. But yeah, I would say after 9/11, big increase, sequestration, and sort of in the latter part of the Obama administration, rather, saw some cuts, and then the Trump administration saw some increases, and since then, relatively steady.
400 ship Navy, how many ships do we normally have?
I think it's less than 200 right now.
But they're pretty big ships.
Um, Capital ships, yeah. That includes carriers, cruisers, destroyers.
Mm-hmm.
It used to include frigates, but apparently we don't have any frigates anymore. I was actually surprised to learn that recently. Apparently we haven't had them for a while. Like, apparently we just retired all of the Oliver Hazard Perry frigates back in like 2015 or something. I totally missed that. I had no idea. I kept thinking we still had lots of frigates, and we don't. Although we are apparently trying to bring them back. Like there's a frigate, there's like a FX program to develop a new frigate, and they are going to try to build those. So we'll have them again, but right now we're sort of between frigates, if you like. If you don't know the significance of frigates, frigates are smaller capital ships, and generally they're used more for stuff like escort duty or routine patrolling. A lot of the time they're used kind of for sub hunting historically, but they're pretty multifaceted. They can kind of do a lot of the simple menial labor, strategic menial labor, if you like, of naval activity. So generally they're smaller, but you have a lot of them, and they just do a lot of the little things that, something like a cruiser would be overkill for.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to look it up. Oh, maybe I was wrong. Maybe it's not 400. Maybe it's 200. Regardless, it's a lot smaller than it used to be. Back during the Cold War, it was several hundred easily. They pretty significantly cut that down over time. All of the wars in the Middle East didn't help. The Navy kind of was hard pressed to argue for big investments in their capacity and procurement during the War on Terror because the Navy was not, well, I mean, it was an important component. It played a role, but not as important as, say, the Marine Corps or the Army, since they were the ones doing a lot of the fighting on the ground, that is to say. Air Force is always pretty wily, so they have a way of getting what they need. Yeah, but since Iraq and now Afghanistan is over, and since the focus is shifting much more on China, I think the Navy is getting a little more traction in some of the Washington budget battles, which are a real thing, by the way. I don't know how familiar people are with the politics of the federal budget in the United States, but the funding that goes to the military is not something that the military as a whole has a united front on. Everybody always argues, hey, we need more money in the military, please give. But there's also big differences about who in the military should get that. So generally, the different branches, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, presumably also the Marine Corps, the so-called, Space Force,
Space
all of
Force.
them, Space Force, yeah, all of them want more of that share of money, and so they actually compete with each other quite a bit and very frequently get involved in, some underhanded tactics of one sort or another, trying to outmaneuver each other by lobbying congressmen and engaging in information campaigns and trying to reach out to people who are veterans or currently serving personnel even to try to kind of convince them that it's a good idea for the sake of the nation, of course, for national security, to write to their congressman or otherwise contact the congressman to try to push them to get more money to, their particular service. Yeah, I think I remember reading from there was a guy talking about it basically who had served, and his description of it was that in terms of inter-service rivalry and budget battles, uh, the Army is dumb, the Navy is duplicitous, and the Air Force is smart. I think was his characterization. I don't know if he mentioned the Marine Corps. Anyway, we were talking about Ukraine.
Yeah. But while we're talking about military shit, there are a bunch of people mentioning the B-21. That's something that got a reveal.
Yeah, they officially kind of rolled it out. They had like a little presentation, one of those kinds of things. But it's not going to be ready for a long time. And we've already kind of known about it for a while now, a couple of years. Yeah, they'd been working on a new bomber for some time.
Mm-hmm.
And, development programs now are always like super drawn out and, over budget and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
I think I did read that the B-21 program is actually under budget, but I don't know if I entirely believe that. We'll see. I want to hear it from somebody more authoritative than, Reddit or Twitter or something.
Turns
But
out it's super
supposedly
cheap to
it's,
make.
yeah, yeah. I think it was, what is it, $700 million a plane? Which is expensive, but it's actually cheaper, I think, than the B1, which is actually replacing. Do you remember the B1?
Mm,
Oh, sorry, B2. My mistake. The B2 bomber. That's the big stealth bomber.
I think if I
Flying
saw
winged.
it, I might recognize the look of it.
Yeah, yeah. It's like a big black flying wing design.
Uh,
We've had it for a while. Yeah, the B1 is actually a separate bomber, although I think. Actually, I think we retired them all by now, didn't we? Yeah, the B1 is actually a really cool looking plane, but it's also just wickedly expensive. And the military has been at pains to justify replacing all of the B-52s with it. And at this point, it's not going to happen, pretty much for sure. But you can kind of tell it's like a newer design for an intercontinental bomber than the B-52. It's just much more sleek and modern, and well, it's just cool looking. High marks for the aesthetics of the B-1B Lancer. Well played to the designers of that plane. But yeah, we don't have very many. And after the Cold War ended in particular, I think there were a lot of cuts. I think at one point they actually gave them to the Arkansas National Guard. As weird as that sounds. It's kind of a cost sharing type thing that they tried to set up.
oh yeah, B1B. I just looked up images of it. It looks super sleek.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was designed in the 70s to replace the B-52, but then the 70s had, some economic problems that I'm sure people remember, successive oil crises, inflation, what have you. And so Congress kind of scuppered it in order to save money. It was later resurrected in the Reagan administration, when they were significantly increasing the budget for the military. One of the things they did was bring back the B-1.
Mm-hmm.
But they never were able to get enough support to try to fund like full replacement of the B-52. They just bought enough to kind of have them around and scare the Russians pretty much.
Hmm.
Yeah, you can see it actually has a swing wing design. Like the wings are actually designed to move. So they can be either swept wing, for the Delta configuration, or they can be straight wing. Straight wing gives you a little more lift, but the Delta wings give you more speed. And the B1, one of the things the B1 was designed to do was to be kind of an infiltrator, right? The B-52 isn't outrunning anything. It's like it's a big lumbering bomber.
Hmm.
It flies high or it flies low, but it's not going to fly fast. So one of the things that designers back in the 70s tried to do with the new aircraft designs of that particular era in order to try to defeat Soviet air defenses was to design very fast aircraft. So this was kind of the era of the SR-71, for example. So similarly, they tried to apply the logic to bombers. There was actually a similar bomber called the XB-70 Valkyrie, which has a very similar design, actually. Very cool aircraft as well, I might add. It has a very 60s futurist feel to it. Aesthetics of aircraft with John Smith today. But yeah, the XB-70 and the B-1 were both designed to be very fast bombers. The idea being that they would outrun, Soviet air defenses of one sort or another, be they missiles or whatever. Soviet missile technology pretty quickly caught up, so that wasn't ever particularly realistic, probably. And after that, they started focusing more on stealth technology to avoid detection in the first place. But regardless, we got a really cool bomber design out of the 70s infatuation with speed. And so that's why it has the swing wings and that particular design. It's designed to go fast despite being, really huge.
Hmm.
So the B-1 was sort of the 70s speed solution, to Soviet air defenses. The B-2 Spirit, the big stealth bomber, that was designed to take the stealth approach. And I think that was designed more in the 80s. And I think we'd already started deploying them before the end of the Cold War, although we kind of just started. And of course, after the Cold War, they declassified it, and it was just like, yeah, we have a thing here. It's very cool. Look at it. But they also started defunding it because, why do we need why do we need $1 billion stealth bomber when the wars that we're getting involved in are like fighting warlords in Somalia or ethnic conflicts in Yugoslavia? It's kind of overkill, right? You don't really need a B-2 bomber for that stuff. So there were pretty big cuts there for a while. They didn't have the heart to completely cut it. They'd spent so much money developing it, and it was such a cool plane, they kept it around. I think the nominal justification was just in case. You never know.
Yeah, what
You never
about
know.
cosmic level threats, dude?
There you go.
You never know when you're going to need a super fast plane.
So we had a couple B1s and B2s for that reason, and the B-21 is apparently designed to replace those specifically. So I think we've already got rid of all the B1s, but now all the B2s are going to be retired, and they're set to be replaced by this newer bomber, the B-21, which is a little smaller, a little cheaper, and basically just kind of does the same thing, but more efficiently. So overall, not a bad approach to the problem, even if isn't necessarily as sexy as one might want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
You hear about a new bomber being designed and you get excited, and then you see the B-21 and it's like, okay, it's like a discount B-2. Fair enough. I'll take it. Can't complain, but still, I was hoping for something a little more exciting, I guess. As an aside here, one of the complaints, maybe not a complaint per se, but one of the notes that people in the aviation community have made is that a lot of the sort of fourth and fifth generation aircraft that have been produced around the world for the past couple decades all pretty much look the same. There's not nearly the same sorts of aesthetic distinguishing features that kind of characterized previous generations. Now there's sort of a convergent evolution in terms of designing aircraft that sort of mix capability with stealth, that is to say maneuverability and stealth, in a way that results in everybody's design kind of looking very, very similar. So it kind of takes a little bit of the fun out, a little bit. And, aircraft will always be cool, but when they start all looking alike, you don't really get the same fun of, comparing different approaches to design problems and stuff like that.
Yeah, but I would think that as you're going faster and faster, you're dealing with the same problems of just air resistance and so on. So the same approximate body shape is going to be the one that's the best value.
Actually, they've been getting slower, not faster. Yeah, faster is less efficient in terms of like fuel economy, in terms of economizing the internals of the aircraft. It actually makes more sense to go a little bit slower and to not worry so much about stuff like super cruise, for example. Just going faster than the speed of sound for some prolonged period. It's again it's very cool, don't get me wrong, but it's not the most useful feature. It's not something that has really been used that much. So designers have kind of shifted away from that. So the result is that aircraft have actually gotten a little slower and a little smaller. Again, the emphasis now is more on stealth features. You want to design the airplane to be a little harder to detect. They're
Mm-hmm.
not full-on stealth aircraft generally, like an F-117 or a B-2 or something. But they do have stealthy features that are meant to make them a little bit marginally harder to detect on radar. So that frequently means using, various kinds of classified composite materials that actually absorb radar energy. But then it also means sort of the angular design that stealth aircraft are kind of known for. Uh, More so the F-22 and the F-117. The B-2 is not particularly angular, but they do have it baked in certain ways. So the design features like that are known to lend themselves to more stealth, those have been incorporated across borders. Pretty much every new aircraft has those to some degree. Unless you're making like a trainer or something, then it doesn't matter. If you don't need stealth features on a trainer. It just needs to be functional in that case.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're like a Boeing or a Lockheed or one of Russia's aeronautics firms, yeah, generally that's more what you're going for at this point. Stealthy features like that. I would add here as an aside that the F-117 is a horrifically ugly plane. And it's not just ugly because of the look, it's actually just not at all aerodynamic. Like the only thing that kept an F-117 in the air was the fly-by-wire system. Like they had to really revamp fly-by-wire systems and innovate like better ones in order to stick one that was sufficiently advanced into the F-117 to correct for all of the bullshit that happens when it was flying. Aircraft are not inherently stable. Like invariably, they kind of wobble a little bit, and there's always just different forces that are impacting the course of the aircraft and its stability. And you can design an aircraft in such a way to minimize that, but in general, it's always a problem. So fly-by-wire systems are basically computers that will adjust the aircraft automatically. They'll detect those little fluctuations in the positioning of the aircraft or wind forces or whatever, and they'll automatically adjust for them so that the pilot has less to focus on. They can focus on the mission, on their instruments, radar, like whatever. So they don't have to focus quite so much on just making sure that, the wind doesn't make their aircraft like change direction, whatever. The F-117 was particularly challenging in that regard because it was very, very unstable. I mean, even just looking at it, you can see that it's not aerodynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to make up for that, they needed a very active and advanced fly-by-wire system to just constantly make adjustments to make sure it just didn't like fly itself right out of the sky, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So ugly plane served its purpose. It was an early model, so it's kind of understandable, but yeah, it's very dated by this point. It's just not pretty. F-35 is much better.
Don't listen to them planes. You're beautiful just the way you are.
So let's see. We talked about the small diameter bomb. Let's see. I guess the other note I had was that over in Russia, car manufacturing since the start of the war has fallen by 90%. And there's also been pretty significant falls in the production of even military equipment, which you would expect would not be the case. You would think they would be pretty focused on that. But as is the disruptions to supply chains for these factories in Russia that produce these kinds of heavy equipment, they've really been struggling to try to procure all of the intermediate goods that they need in order to produce. So sanctions are definitely having an impact in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably going to get worse, I would assume. There are alternative producers. Turkey and China produce a lot of intermediate goods for things like cars and machinery and whatnot. So they could hypothetically pick up the slack. But I also think that a lot of firms in China or Turkey are going to be real careful about that because if they get found out, there's going to be a lot of punishment. Even in China, which is a very large country, it's got its own internal economy that's one of the largest in the world, but there's still a lot of firms there that want rather access to the global market. And if it's found that they're supplying, Russian manufacturers, they're going to get slammed right out of the international market. And, they would probably be okay, but they're not going to make nearly as much money. So that's a pretty decent deterrent. And the Chinese government doesn't really care enough about Russia, to kind of risk it, to kind of push those firms to supply Russia anyway. It's not really worth it to them. The cost benefit analysis of an alliance with Russia is not particularly favorable. The Russian economy is just not really large enough to make it sufficiently attractive in that regard. Right now, the only thing Russia really has to offer to China is natural resources and maybe some expertise in things like designing aircraft. But beyond that, not much. There's nothing Russia produces that China can't produce probably much cheaper at this point, given how successful China's manufacturing sector has been. So that gives China a lot of leverage. And right now, they're mostly using it just to get discounted stuff from Russia, oil and natural gas specifically. I'm sure they're probably more involved in the conflict in Ukraine than is probably widely known right now, but I don't know how involved they're really interested in getting. I suspect it's probably pretty limited. Let's see. There's some analysts talking about Russia depleting its supplies of missiles because of all of the attacks on the electricity infrastructure in Ukraine. That's probably true. They've still been able to keep up production of those weapons, though. It's not entirely clear how, but probably a lot of stuff off of the black market and smuggled stuff. They're still, I mean, we're able to kind of find these missiles when they land in Ukraine, or after the fact, rather. And of course, they do a little forensics whenever they do to try to figure out, what kind of stuff they're putting into the missiles, where they're sourcing inputs, that kind of thing. And there's a pretty decent number of Western electronics in there, specifically microchips and a lot of Russia's smarter munitions. And there's some question as to where they came from. Some of them have probably just been stockpiled. It's no secret that, Russia has been under pressure from the West for some time. Sanctions obviously were not strong enough to deter an invasion of Ukraine, for example, but the Russians themselves knew that if there were future tensions, and they expected there to be, then they would probably be cut off from supplies of sensitive stuff that they couldn't produce themselves, stuff like microchips. So they started hoarding them. They started buying up as many as they could and creating a stockpile. So that's probably responsible for some of the production there. But it's also suspected that they're kind of dodging sanctions, that they're able to use smuggling networks to get stuff through sort of third-party countries that don't really care that much one way or the other. Turkey's probably a prominent example there. How many microchips they're getting through those networks is a little unclear, but they're probably using them to some degree. I would be shocked if they were not. China's probably going to, if it isn't already, start using very similar networks. Just as an aside here, I would point out that one of the big issues, quote unquote, in international politics going forward is going to be smuggling. We haven't really heard a whole lot about smuggling outside of things like drug trafficking. But, that was so particular, though, that people didn't even really call it smuggling. They just said drug trafficking. That was the issue. That was an issue unto itself. But now, just more broadly speaking, smuggling itself will be an issue and the subject of negotiations between countries. That's something they're going to try to clamp down on to prevent technology from getting to countries like Russia and China that are nominal rivals of the West. But for now, it's still early days, so those networks are kind of going more or less unmolested right now. So it'll probably be some time before they can be unwound, if they're unwound at all, depending on the kind of pressure that can be brought to bear against them. But the point here is that Russia's supply of missiles has been dwindling. They've been blowing through so many. And even if they can continue production of those weapons, they're still not going to be able to produce as many as they need. So they are facing something of a time crunch. And unlike Ukraine, they don't have the better part of the world's manufacturing capacity working for them. If they got China really helping them out, that would be uh, significant. But again, like I said earlier, I don't think China's really that interested in doing it. So I think that's going to create an interesting strategic quandary for Russia, since if they actually do fail to find sufficient replacements for the inputs they need and fail to significantly scale up production of war material to the degree that they need, then they either have to end the war quickly or they have to dig in for some kind of grinding, inevitable endgame. And I don't think they're going to like either choice. And, I don't think the Russian government is as unpredictable as some people have said it is. Some people are kind of worried about, well, what if Putin feels cornered and launches nukes and starts World War III? That's pretty unlikely. The thing about mafia states is that they're very self-interested. They're not really innately ideological. The communists were more of an issue because they had an ideological reason to believe that war was inevitable and therefore had an incentive to strike first.
Mm-hmm.
But Putin is not really an ideologue. The most you could say is he's a nationalist, but even then, that's not even entirely true. Again, in autocratic political systems, the principal ideology is self-interest. And a nuclear war does not really serve anybody's self-interest. So threats that he's going to just nuke the world because of Ukraine, not really that credible. If he were a communist or some kind of rabid Russian nationalist, then yeah, I could kind of see it. But as is, he would just lose everything. He would lose his patronage network. He would lose all the money, lose all the, palatial estates. Like, there's no incentive for him personally to do that. You could argue that he would lose it if he lost the war anyway, but I don't think that's true. I think if Russia lost the war, probably Putin would be fine. Him and his patronage network would just come up with whatever kinds of excuses they would need, and then combine that with state repression to maintain control. I don't get the impression that civil society in Russia is really strong enough to challenge him even in dire circumstances like those that the Russia is in right now. So probably he would be fine. And that means that probably threats of nuclear retaliation or even a nuclear first strike are probably just hot air. I don't think he's actually issuing credible threats there.
Yeah,
But yeah, that
talk is pretty cheap, and talking aggressive is something that a lot of strongman type leaders are known for doing.
yeah. But that's just to illustrate that I don't think he's, irrational. I think he's more rational. I don't think the threat of, escalation is as bad as people think.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of lost my train of thought in that process, so I'm not entirely sure where I was going with that, but maybe, hopefully, somebody learned something from it.
We've been meandering around sexy planes, ugly planes, Ukraine, Russia.
My fault. That's my divine punishment for going off topic.
That's fun though. That's one of the things that whether you're a pacifist or a militarist, like whether a plane looks cool, I think that's something that kids can figure out for themselves with
Yeah.
very little training. Whoa, cool plane.
Actually, speaking of tangents, guess I guess here's another one. Did you see the crash at the Dallas Air Show a couple weeks ago?
Yeah. They just heckin' smacked into each other in the air.
It did. That was wild. Yeah, that's pretty sad. Especially losing the air crew.
Yeah.
Bad enough to lose the airplane, but they lost the crew as well. Yeah, it's hard to lose folks like that. They're pretty rare commodities. Not everybody knows how to repair a half-century plus old bomber. It's a rare skill set. And even those that have it don't always have the money to do anything about it. So, yeah, tough loss. Tough loss.
Yeah, it's what I saw was that one of the planes was in the other one's blind spot and they're doing some pretty tricky maneuvers. That's kind of the whole shebang for these shows is they're trying to show off what the planes can do. So they're pushing it more to the limit than you might for just a normal reconnaissance mission or something.
Yeah, it's not clear exactly what happened. Um, But yeah, you're right about the blind spot. That's the real problem. The smaller aircraft. I thought the smaller aircraft was a P-51. It actually has a similar profile, but it actually turned out to be some weird plane that I hadn't really heard of before. It's like a P-61 or something like that, something funky like that. It's basically like an upgraded version of the Air Cobra, which is one of the more obscure planes in World War II. But anyway, that aircraft has like, big blind spots, sitting in the car. I think I sent you a picture or a link or something in Discord
Hmm.
after it happened, and it shows what the cockpit looked like, and it's very obvious that, you just can't see shit.
Hmm.
You can see pretty much what's directly in front of you, what's over you, and that's about it. And you can see in the footage that the aircraft was banking.
Hmm.
That is to say, it was turning. And the bomber was actually physically, so to speak, to the right of the aircraft. And given that the aircraft was banking, that meant that the pilot just had no chance. Like he had no idea where that bomber was. And the bomber too, obviously, didn't think anybody was going to like rear end him in the air, so they didn't see it coming either.
Hmm.
So yeah, it was just dead on impact. Cut the bomber in half pretty much. Hate to see it,
Yep.
but it happens.
And these are pretty good pilots too. It's not like it's just random people up there trying to fly the planes. So.
Mhm. Yeah, it might have just been bad timing because
Hmm.
they do rehearse this stuff before they actually do the air show.
Hmm.
So it just may have been that somebody was out of position or somebody was late or somebody was early, and the result is that somebody, either the big plane or the little plane was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And given the lack of visibility inside some of the aircraft, that's tough to adjust to on the fly,
Hmm.
so to speak. Let's see. Supposedly, Russia only has a month's worth of artillery shells left. Maybe. I don't entirely believe that because I've been hearing people say that for like 6 months now.
Hmm.
So make of that what you will. But I don't think it's a stretch to say they're facing logistical difficulties. I think that much is true. And pretty much everybody is at this point. Oh, this is a fun one. So Joe Biden had a state dinner with the president of France, Mr. Macron. And he told Macron that he would be willing to talk with Vladimir Putin if Putin wanted to negotiate some kind of end to the war. So that's basically an example of negotiating through the press. Of course, word of that got to the press, they published it. So how does Vladimir Putin respond? Well, Putin says that talks could only start if Russian annexations of Ukrainian territories were recognized,
Hmm.
which is a way of saying no. Obviously, the West is not going to agree to that. So basically, Putin is saying no talks. It's not happening anytime soon.
I feel like a
No
talk is going
surprise.
to be pretty difficult to work anyway because, like, the thing that the West wants and what Ukraine wants is for Ukraine to get all of Ukraine's borders back,
Hmm.
which would be a massive loss for Russia. So it seems like I don't know where the compromise point would be there.
Yeah, therein lie the rub. The Ukrainians are doing okay. They're kind of holding their own, and they, of course, want to liberate all of their territory.
Mm-hmm.
Very understandable even before the war started, let alone after all of the atrocities in places like Bucha came to light. So, no shock there. Uh, but also for the Russians, the Russian government doesn't really care that much. They can tank losses basically, so to speak. It doesn't matter to them too much. And the government is principally interested in not embarrassing itself, at least not any more than it already has been, and trying to extract something from the Ukraine adventure so that they can pretend that it served the national interest to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
But unless the West jumps directly into the war, I don't think the Russian government will be sufficiently threatened, will feel sufficiently threatened to feel compelled to negotiate an end to the conflict. Now, of course, that could change. The 2020s are nothing if not all about unpredictable, crazy shit happening. So I don't want to say never. But for the moment, unless something changes in the underlying calculus, there's not really much reason for either party to really negotiate.
Hmm.
Hypothetically, the West could strong arm Ukraine into giving concessions of some kind or push them into a negotiation. But I don't think anybody in the West really feels particularly compelled to do that right now. I think most people are still pretty sympathetic to the Ukrainians, and are willing to kind of put up with some of the aftershocks of things like energy disruptions and whatnot that have kind of fallen out and impacted people outside of Ukraine. So, in that sense, foreign support for Ukraine remains robust.
Hmm.
And so that means that most likely the West will just continue to shovel supplies and munitions and weapons to Ukraine as much as is possible. Yeah, speaking to go on another tangent, to go on another tangent, if you study military history, one of the things that comes up a lot when you study conflicts, especially sort of smaller conflicts that don't involve major powers, or maybe only involves one major power, is that frequently foreign support or foreign impressions of the conflict are an important theater, right? It's not a theater in the sense that it's a front where, people are actually fighting, and it's not really about logistics necessarily, but just managing foreign perspectives and impressions can actually be important unto itself historically. So, for example, in the American Civil War, the Union and the Confederacy both kind of appealed to European nations to support one or the other in the conflict, which was why the Emancipation Proclamation was, important, or at least one of the reasons it was important, because it cemented the image of the war in Europe as a war of liberation, and not just a giant clusterfuck in North America in which everybody was killing themselves. So that significantly undercut the political support of people who were more inclined to support the Confederacy, not necessarily out of sympathy, but just more out of opportunism. So that kind of illustrates the importance there of managing foreign impressions. And I'm used to seeing historical examples, but I don't think I've seen a contemporary modern example of that until Ukraine. I mean, it's always been important to varying degrees in pretty much every conflict that happens, but in Ukraine, it's particularly notable, not least because it involves, my own country and the broader West. Uh, but just you rarely see it in such stark terms. Like you can very easily see how Ukraine would be very negatively impacted if there were a significant erosion in Western support stemming from an erosion in, sentiment.
Hmm.
So just speaking from a military history perspective, very interesting and notable in that sense. Also, keep an eye on that. There's been surveys and stuff keeping track of Western sentiment specifically for this reason. And people are still broadly sympathetic to Ukraine in Europe, also the United States, but Europe is kind of more what people are paying attention to because Europe's been impacted much more by the energy disruptions. But people in Germany did suggest, I mean, surveys of people in Germany did suggest that people are still pretty cool on the idea of sending more weapons. That's not as popular as, say, sending money or something like that, or providing diplomatic support. Taking in millions of refugees and sending billions of dollars worth of stuff, especially weapons, that's more controversial. So, in so much as there's a potential catalyst for an erosion of Western sentiment, refugees and money, specifically weapons, and the risk of escalation with Russia, that's probably more where it will stem from. If it happens at all. I'm not saying it's inevitable, but that's probably how it could happen, how it would happen if it did happen. And I might add, that's part of the reason that Russia is going out of its way to target the electricity grid in Ukraine. That generates more refugees. In fact, the Ukrainian government itself came out and said that, if you're in an area that's suffering from repeated blackouts and, resulting in you being at risk of freezing, it might be a good idea for you just to leave Ukraine for a while until we're able to stabilize the situation.
Hmm.
So the calculus there is that the more refugees that Russia can generate, the more pressure that supporting Ukraine will incur on the part of the West. Since obviously Europe has something of an issue with refugees at this point, owing to the immigration crisis that started up in the middle of the last decade. And it's not just, conflicting culture or stuff like that. Like it is just really expensive to host millions of refugees. Like it does cost a lot of money. The culture war stuff is just an unfortunate, corollary to that causes its own problems. But, even just the money can be very controversial. Kind of always has been, like a lot of before the 20 teens. Mostly it was developing countries that had to deal with refugees because mostly it was, conflicts in Africa, conflicts in the Middle East and whatnot that were generating refugees. And the result is that neighboring African nations and Middle Eastern nations were hosting most of them. And they complained bitterly about the cost. And it was easily one of the big political issues in those nations that did have to carry the burden of trying to deal with all of the refugees. But of course, the West kind of just hectored them, kind of shook their finger at them and said, yes, it's expensive, but it's the right thing to do. You shouldn't complain about it. It's the right and humanitarian approach to the problem. And so skip ahead a couple, 10 years so, and suddenly the shoe is on the other foot. And now the Europeans as a people are kind of finding their inner skeptic as far as refugees go. So yeah, money has always been a problem. It doesn't matter if it's a first world country or a developing country. The cost of refugees is always politically contentious. So Russia's going to try to ramp that up as much as they can, which is a pretty scummy thing to do, but, it's a pretty scummy war in the grand scheme of things. It's not particularly necessary and certainly very badly planned. Bad enough to start a war, even worse to start a badly planned one. It's kind of like trying to execute somebody with drugs that don't work or a, guillotine with a rusty blade, something
Or
like
hitting
that.
them to death with a spoon. Have you seen that YouTube video?
Oh, that's a YouTube video.
Tell me someone in the chat has seen that.
Oh, I thought that was a reference to The Princess Bride.
No. That's actually
Oh,
a video.
interesting.
There's a person who like gets chased by a person and they're just hitting them with a regular like kitchen spoon repeatedly. And it doesn't really like you're not going to kill them with the spoon hit, but it's unpleasant and they gradually get like a black eye and it's just a very moderate level of discomfort over a long period of time. Chat's this good old video. Yeah, can we get a link for that in the chat? We need to catch up Agent Smith on his memes. I may not know as much about the world as Agent Smith, but I've heckin' seen some shit on the internet.
There you go. Well, thank you for keeping me appraised.
Yep. Wouldn't want you to fall behind and look like you're not hip with the memes.
Yeah, I am getting older. Maybe it's to be expected. Well, let's see. Oh, yeah, there was some talk about casualties. So Mark Milley, the chairman of America's Joint Chiefs of Staff, was saying that the approximation of the U.S. military at this point is that both sides have lost, in terms of dead and injured, casualties, each side has lost about 100,000 casualties. So 200,000 total thus far.
So it's about equal?
Yeah, that's the expectation.
And does that include civilian and military deaths or total?
That is a good question. There was some commentary on that about the Ukrainian numbers potentially including civilian numbers. But that wasn't made clear. The Pentagon is always pretty cagey about stuff like that. And of course, Russia and Ukraine are also very cagey about the numbers. So,
Well, they
who's
always
to
want the
say?
numbers to look good for them.
Yeah, exactly. But probably casualties are pretty even, most likely. The Ukrainians, often have better training, better equipment, but they're also a little bit outnumbered in some cases, and they have shortfalls in terms of things like artillery and smart munitions, like cruise missiles and whatnot. And both sides have been going full ham in terms of, needling each other with drone strikes and things like that. Not like advanced drones either. I mean, like the little commercial drones that you can jury rig to drop grenades and stuff.
Yeah.
There's a steady stream of quote unquote combat footage, if you can even call it that, taken from drones just dropping grenades on people in like foxholes and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we've talked about it before, but it's worth reiterating. The Eastern Front in Ukraine in Donbass, and particularly around the town of Bakhmut, has basically just become World War I style trench warfare. Just long lines of trenches, fortifications, massive artillery barrages, and now you can also add, the more modern stuff like drones, little commercial drones doing their own damage. Not a great place to be an infantryman. Yeah, would not recommend that in the least. But given that is the style of warfare that we're looking at, it's not hard to see how casualties would rack up. And neither side has such an advantage over the other that they can't prevent the other side from inflicting pretty significant casualties. We often see Russian casualties in the media, but that's because we tend to watch like Reddit and stuff like that, and Western news outlets and whatnot. But there's actually just as much footage of Russians, destroying Ukrainian units and Ukrainian infantry. It's just that those images and video are generally restricted to places like Telegram, which is a social media application that is prominently and predominantly used by Russians and not so much by Westerners. Also, a lot of it is in Russian, so even if you want to go look at it, you can't really read much unless you can read and speak the language. So there's sort of two separate media environments there, and we kind of get a biased look at the conflict. But considering just how much death and destruction we're talking about, yeah, the fact that Russia and Ukraine might have even numbers of casualties is actually not a stretch. It's worth mentioning that it's not as backbreaking for Ukraine as you might think. Russia has more people overall, but Ukraine also started their mobilization much, much earlier than Russia. So they're actually ahead of the game in that sense. They've got more people mobilized than the Russians do at this juncture. So even though they don't have as many people to work with in the first place, they're actually fielding more of them for the moment. And the Russians, of course, have not really deployed like the full might, of their demographic advantage. So they're a little bit short in that sense. Thank you. Take a look at that later.
He's now more up to date on the memes.
Much
Thanks,
appreciated.
chat, for the link. Yeah, the full title of this short film is "The Horribly Slow Murderer with the Extremely Inefficient Weapon."
See. And I could skip that. What else did I have? Oh, there was an interview. Have you ever heard of Lindy Beige?
No.
He's a YouTuber. He does like history content and stuff. I think he's British, if I'm not mistaken. But when the war started, he interviewed a guy, a British dude. I think he like organized festivals or something. And he kind of heard the call when the war started, and he wanted to go volunteer. And so, I guess Lindy Beige knew him, and so he organized an interview and talked with him about sort of why he was going and his motivations and what his expectations were and whatnot. And it was kind of done, given that he produced history content and the war in Ukraine was a historical event. He thought the opportunity to talk to one of the guys that was trying to join the International Legion, which is something that also has historical precedent in European history. You can look at the International Brigade in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, for example. He took a particular interest, and so recorded that interview and put it on his YouTube channel. So a week or two ago, he posted he posted a new video with that same guy, and he'd been fighting in Ukraine basically ever since, and so he basically just caught up to date with the guy, kind of asked him what his experience with the Legion was, what it was like fighting there, his impressions of the Ukrainian military, just, the whole experience, basically, just trying to get him to divulge it. And it's a very interesting interview. I highly recommend it to people who are curious about, a firsthand account of the war in Ukraine. And in particular, a firsthand account from the perspective of an international volunteer.
Do you have a link handy for that?
I do.
Cool, I
I
can
can
paste that in
send
chat.
that to you. Uh, Excel. Why is Excel like this? I can't copy paste directly from Excel. I have to do it from something else. There we go. Yeah, I thought some of the highlights for me. He did report that there was some corruption in the Ukrainian military. So that had been a point raised by skeptics of Western support for Ukraine. The idea being that Ukraine suffers from so much corruption that, the weapons and money and stuff would be abused or, misdirected or stolen or whatever. So his account suggests that there was some evidence of that, but that it was not like endemic. And a lot of the people responsible were kind of in the process of getting weeded out, basically, over time. He also noted that some people in the International Legion itself were sort of thieves, which kind of surprised me. Not everybody going to fight was sort of this, noble volunteer who wanted to fight for democracy in Ukraine. Some of them were opportunists. Although he also makes the point that those people were also weeded out, not just by, catching them stealing and then kicking them out. I got the impression he meant that a lot of them actually just quit on their own. It's one thing to get the opportunity to make some money and steal some shit in a war. It's another thing when you actually have to fight in it and it turns into a really, gruesome conflict of the kind that Ukraine has kind of evolved into. So, you've got to have a really strong constitution to kind of stick it out on the kinds of, World War One battlefields that we're talking about in Ukraine. And the result is a lot of the opportunists who volunteered ended up leaving because they couldn't hack it. He just didn't think that they were willing to take the kinds of risks to get the kind of thieving rewards that they were looking for. Yeah, I won't spoil too much of it here. I would definitely encourage people to watch it. But I did, just as a note here, a final note on the video. I found it really interesting near the end of the video when he started talking about the quality of the different international volunteers. So in general, he said that the French volunteers and the Spanish volunteers were really good. He had a very high opinion of them. Um, he also noted that there were a lot of, it won't surprise anybody, but there was a lot of people from like Eastern Europe there, lots of volunteers from the Baltics, from Poland, etc. And his opinion of the volunteers from North America, though, I found particularly notable. He had a very mixed opinion of them. So, according to him, the American volunteers who were veterans of the 10th Mountain Division or the Army Rangers, those guys were really good. He said that he really liked them and respected them. And really, one of the most fascinating things he said he had a lot of respect for the volunteers from the United States who had no military experience. And that really surprised me because I'd known even before that interview that one of the problems that the International Legion had is that they had a lot of inexperienced people coming to volunteer that just didn't know what they were doing. And the Ukrainian army and government did not have the resources to just train them up and equip them, in a short amount of time. And so was overwhelmed by these people. It wasn't really worth it to have them around because, just logistically speaking, they were more of a burden than they were a benefit. So I had not gotten the impression that the inexperienced volunteers were really very helpful overall. But this guy was suggesting that actually, at least the American ones were actually relatively helpful. And he says that it wasn't so much because they were necessarily like really good fighters per se. It was more that they didn't complain. His impression of them is that, when they were sent out, when they were deployed, they just accepted conditions as they were and dealt with them as best they could. So even if they weren't necessarily the best fighters, he respected them a lot for that, for sticking out the conflict, for sticking it out through like the worst of the combat, which again, very tough in Ukraine. Now, the people that he did not respect from North America involved specifically Canadians, weirdly, and also Americans who had military experience, but were more just like regulars, like just regular members of the military. Apparently, a lot of them, specifically speaking of the regulars, apparently a lot of those volunteers had unrealistic expectations about what the front line would be like. So a lot of these guys fought in like places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were just so used to having a lot of fire support that they found it hard to cope, apparently, with the conditions on the front line in Ukraine. Like in Ukraine, the army does not have a lot of support from, say, aircraft or even artillery. Like with artillery, it can take a lot of time, apparently, to get fire support, in place and going. And apparently, according to him, again, this is all his account, he was saying that some of the American veterans seemed a little spoiled. Like he didn't think they quite knew how to handle being in a war with a near peer fighting, in which they couldn't just bring overwhelming firepower to bear against. So he was a little skeptical about those people, and he noted that a lot of them ended up leaving because they could just, again, the conditions were just so bad that they couldn't hack it. So didn't particularly respect them. And the Canadians he didn't respect because a lot of them just had no experience at all. Apparently, a lot of them had been in the Canadian Army, but had not ever actually fought anywhere or been deployed anywhere. And apparently, with them in particular, there was a lot of problems with people leaving after experiencing conditions on the front line. And apparently, they were just overwhelmed and couldn't deal with it. So, a really fascinating look there at some of the International Legion, and also illustrating just how tough the conditions are. Very interesting video. I recommend.
I linked it in the chat.
Let's see. Oh yeah, this is more of a note about Russia. So this isn't something I have like a specific article to refer that I can kind of cite, but it's more something I've seen analysts kind of talking about online, on Twitter and occasionally, in other media. But basically, what they've been kind of referring to and talking about is that a lot of regional leaders in Russia, specifically governors of oblasts, I'm probably mispronouncing that. I apologize if so. But basically, like Russian provinces have their own governors, and a lot of them have been raising quote unquote volunteer armies. The idea being that they want to raise volunteers to go fight in Ukraine in order to help serve the nation. But it's been noted that a lot of these volunteers never actually deploy, and that a lot of them are actually being kept in the provinces. And maybe it doesn't mean anything, but there's some suspicion among some of the analysts that maybe regional actors are raising these armies not to be volunteer armies to fight in Ukraine, but to be personal armies that can be deployed to fight on behalf of the governor if there's some kind of collapse in authority within Russia. And even if there's not a collapse of authority, they could still be useful if there comes a period where there's a lot of infighting between Russian elites. And we're already starting to actually see some of that, in particular with Prigozhin, the guy who leads the Wagner group. He's starting to throw his weight around basically just more and more over time. And there's some concern that he may stage some kind of, not a coup per se, but he may make a series of power plays trying to push out his rivals and expand his own influence within the Russian government. Mind you, within the context of Putin's patronage network, he's not going to challenge Putin, but he can challenge other people who are also in Putin's patronage network. And certain other political factions and regional leaders seem to be hedging their bets on that right now. And that could come in the form of some kind of violence perpetrated by some of these quote unquote volunteer armies. They haven't done anything yet. Certainly not anything newsworthy, but it's just notable that they exist at all and that they're being kept in Russia. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on going forward.
Speaking of Putin, chat is asking Agent Smith, do you think the story of Putin falling down the stairs is true?
I hadn't heard that. I haven't heard anything about him falling down anything. So I'm a little skeptical, but maybe I just missed the story. I'm not seeing anything in BBC about it. Kind of sounds like maybe just some propaganda, but I guess I would have to ask for a link or something to see what the source was. Yeah, a lot of people made fun of George W. Bush, of how clumsy he was and whatnot. So I heard a lot of stuff like that about him back in the day.
You know what video we watched of George W. Bush recently is when someone threw a shoe at him. And he heckin' dodged it. And then they threw a second shoe, and then he swoop dodged it again, some Dragon Ball Z style.
So I remember funny. That when it happened. Yeah. It was way back in, what was it? Oh, it must have been like 2007, 2008.
Yeah.
Something like that. Kind of right at the end of his administration. Yeah, the guy throwing the shoes was a Iraqi reporter And for those of you maybe not familiar with the incident, George W. Bush went to Iraq and talked to the prime minister at the time of Iraq. I believe it was still al-Maliki at that time. And during their little press conference, one of the Iraqi journalists just got ripshit pissed and threw his shoes at him, which sounds very non sequitur, I'm sure, but keep in mind that in the Middle East, maybe more specifically Arab culture, it's considered very insulting to hit something or touch something even with the bottom of your shoe. The bottom of your shoe is considered to be dirty. So if you want to disrespect something, you can walk on it or, touch your shoe to it or even just take off your shoe and rub it on it, something like that. It's just considered it's a cultural thing, basically. It's just a sign of disrespect. So this guy wanted to show his own personal disrespect, to George W. Bush by throwing his shoes at him. Again, once you understand the cultural context, it makes more sense. But for a lot of Americans, it was very, very weird.
Yeah, they'd be like, "Oh, free shoes. Actually, these aren't my size." No, but that's the thing you do when you're really mad. I know there are other historical expressions of anger and such, like tearing your shirt and stuff. Kind of depends on the cultural context and what it means. You can do a lot of different things in anger, and the impact of that kind of depends on that context. But yeah, he dodged those shoes.
With alacrity.
Yep, say what you will about his administration and his decisions, but the shoe missed.
And let's see. Well, the only other note I had here on Ukraine regarded a secret program that the UK was operating that involved them assisting Ukraine and its government with cyber defenses. So it wasn't really known in the early days of the war because, just wasn't a lot of information, but it came out later that the Russians actually made a pretty significant effort to attack Ukraine's networks, via hacking and whatnot. But part of the reason it didn't really have too much of an impact was because before the war, like immediately before the war, the US had been working with them to try to fortify their networks, as well as their network security. But also, after the US left, again, just in the lead up to the war, the British started a secret program to assist them with that. It was I think I read that it had a £6 million budget, thereabouts. So that had been a secret program, but then it was just recently revealed, I think, in the past week or so. Doesn't necessarily say too much. I don't think it surprises anybody that there's clandestine support to Ukraine going on, but I thought it was worth mentioning that network security in particular is something that Britain and the United States have a strength in. So that was a very particular area where we could assist them, and apparently were. Well, I think that's all I had for Ukraine. Was there any other particular region or issue you wanted to kind of touch on here? Or did we have questions?
Someone in the chat linked the stair falling situation, a couple articles on that. I can pass those to you in Discord. I wasn't able to look at them because I have Hellions driving into my base.
Well, thank you. Whenever you have the time, much appreciated.
Cool. Yeah, I think for a while there have been a lot of general articles about the state of Putin's health not being good, and that potentially being a factor of desperation, but it's going to be really hard to get an impartial confirmation one way or the other, because Russia obviously wants him to look strong and his opponents obviously want him to look weak, so heavy incentive for informational warfare.
Very much so. Hence my skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
chat is screaming China, please.
Yeah, that was definitely top of the list for me. That was what I was kind of angling for.
All right.
Well, let's see. Temp, what did I do with it? Yeah, China's been very active. Have you heard anything about this?
No, I've been pretty involved with the subathon, so I haven't really had as much time to browse.
Oh, really? So this will be news for you. Okay.
Yes. I have seen the chat saying a bunch of stuff about it, but not really specific enough that I could glean what was going on.
Gotcha.
But some shit is going on, is what I can gather.
Yeah, the past week, basically. Specifically, it started last Monday. Yeah, this past Monday is when it started, although it had kind of been going on before that. All right, so it has to do with COVID-19 and specifically China's zero COVID policy,
Mm-hmm.
which of course is very restrictive and very disruptive to daily life in China. And they've been doing it since the pandemic started with no let up. So people are pretty exhausted by it at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And, the lockdowns are not necessarily the problem per se. The bigger problem is that local officials in particular, local government leaders, sometimes implement the rules very stupidly or maybe corruptly, depending on who you talk to the point where people are often harmed more by the lockdown than they would have been if they'd just gotten sick with COVID. So, specific examples are, stories about, well, I can tell you one that I heard from a friend. There was a story making the rounds a couple months ago in China about a woman whose mother had actually accidentally fallen off of their balcony uh, and died. But she could not go outside to get the body because that is to say, the government had literally just blocked the entrance. Understand in China, when they do a lockdown, they don't just say, hey, you need to stay in your home. They'll literally identify the specific apartments where people who are supposed to quarantine live, and they will barricade all of the entrances and exits to that building so that nobody can get in or out. And when I say barricade, I mean like fences, barbed wire, like the whole thing. Sometimes I've even seen footage of them, that is to say, government officials putting barbed wire in stairwells to prevent people from leaving. So that's obviously serious business. Like when they do that, it's really hard to leave, even if you want to break quarantine. So this lady, apparently, so the story goes, just had to kind of wait for like hours and hours while her dead mother just laid out in the street, and she just couldn't do anything about it. So that's just one story. There's a whole bunch of those. That's not even one of the high profile ones. There was like a bus that crashed and killed a bunch of people who had been, I think they were being transported to quarantine. Sometimes the government doesn't quarantine you in your home. Sometimes they actually force you to go to a special facility that is designed specifically to quarantine people. So some people were being transported to one of those, and I think the bus or truck or whatever crashed, and a whole bunch of them got killed. And there's, of course, all of the stories from Shanghai last year where people were stuck at home and couldn't get any food. They were stuck, couldn't go outside to get more food, didn't have enough at home, and the government wasn't really doing enough to ensure supplies. They were doing some, but it just wasn't enough. So there was a bunch of horror stories about people not getting enough food to survive, or even not getting basic medicine. People who had cancer couldn't get their chemotherapy. People who were diabetic couldn't get their insulin. A lot of stories like that. And so it's really more bad implementation of that variety that has really got people in China turning against zero COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Because in 2020, people were a lot more patient with it. In 2020, there was a sense, there was more of a siege mentality almost. There was a sense that COVID-19 was a real threat, that the Chinese government was preventing contagion, and that they were having the best experience, basically, of anybody in 2020 as far as the pandemic went. But 2021 comes, people are kind of expecting things to ease up like things are in the rest of the world, and then it doesn't happen. And then you get the big shutdown in Shanghai, which shocked everybody because, people in the big cities in China have higher expectations as far as the quality of governance that they experience on day to day. Everybody kind of knows things in rural China are kind of more corrupt, inefficient, etc. But people who live in the cities kind of think, well, our governors are not that bad. City officials are not that bad. We have a relatively high quality of life. Even if people are screwing up things in other parts of China, we're at least doing well. So that had been the case through 2020, but then in 2021, they got one of the worst, most restrictive lockdowns that China had had. And nobody in urban China had thought that would even really be possible. So that in particular was shocking for them. So that really kind of woke people up to the fact that the government was not going to back off of zero COVID, and that bad implementation of zero COVID was not just going to be restricted to like the most corrupt, backwards parts of China. It was going to be a shared experience, if you like. So starting in 2021, you really see a lot more resentment about lockdowns and zero COVID. And the government just did not do itself any favors. There were just more and more news stories about people suffering because of the government being overly inflexible as far as putting people in quarantine and just failing to take care of them, among other forms of mistreatment. And that bled directly into 2022, where it continued to snowball. And it's worth mentioning too that I'm talking more from the perspective of, urban Chinese. Those are kind of more the people I know. But it's also important to keep in mind that a much bigger group that is much more angry about zero COVID is actually the rural migrant workers. I think I've talked a little bit about this before. But basically, if you're just some poor guy, like you're a poor farmer or just otherwise from a more poor backwards region of inland China, you probably have to travel pretty far, probably to the coasts or to one of the larger cities in order to find a job. And you're already not treated particularly well when you do that. I don't know how many people listening are familiar with the Hukao system, but that's a system of residential permits in China. Like here in the United States, if you want to move from one part of the country to the other, nobody gives a shit. Like that's your business. You don't need any kind of like official permission to do that. But in places like China, and well, specifically in China in this case, you actually do need a permit. You need to have a permit that shows that you were living in a given area legally. And, to go on a little tangent here, this is actually why residential permits in places like Beijing and some of the other tier one cities are immensely valuable because they're actually pretty hard to get. And these are very attractive places to live, not just because they have higher quality of life, but because they have more jobs and amenities and whatnot. So it's kind of like a market for it. I don't think there's that much corruption per se, but the fact that tier one city residential permits are so valued kind of illustrates just how restrictive the system is. And it is restrictive. So to kind of go back to the migrant workers here, if you're a migrant worker and you don't have a residential permit, you can't get official legal education for your kids. You can't get public welfare of any kind, or at least most kinds. Some cities are more liberal about that than others, but in general, your access to public resources is significantly restricted in terms of education for your kids, welfare, and other forms of support, and whatnot. So if you're a migrant worker in urban China and you don't have a residential permit, which is most of them, you're getting a subpar experience and you're already not feeling particularly well treated just from the get-go. But at least you're making money. In general, city officials are kind of willing to look the other way, even if you don't have a residential permit. And so you can kind of go there, you can kind of suffer the shitty conditions, but then make some money, send the money back home to your family, get your kids educated there, save for retirement, build a house for your parents or whatever. Just do whatever you need to do. It was a workable situation at least. But here comes zero COVID, and all of a sudden, migrant workers would get caught up in lockdowns. So they would be forced to stay in their dormitories. A lot of migrant workers don't have their own like apartments in the coastal cities that they work in. A lot of them will just end up working in dormitories owned by the factory they work at. So what'll happen is there'll be a lockdown, and then all of the workers in the dormitory, if one of them is found to be infected, will just be trapped in the dormitory. Like the local government will just quarantine them there, and they won't be able to leave. And the thing about the dormitories is that they're not always free. And even, obviously, if you don't live in the dormitory, you're probably renting an apartment. That's obviously not free. But even in the dormitories, people have to spend money. But if you're stuck in the dormitory in quarantine, your employer does not have to keep paying you, but they will keep charging you. So that's especially a problem if you're renting an apartment somewhere, because then the guy that owns the apartment, of course, is still charging you rent. But if you're in quarantine, you can't make that money. So the only way to solve that is to dig into your savings or to borrow money. And of course, borrowing money, if you're just like a poor migrant worker, probably means borrowing from unsavory local characters of one sort or another. which is not a great choice. Nobody wants to do that. So the lockdowns had a disproportionately negative impact on migrant workers. A lot of them basically just went broke because they couldn't make any money, but they still had to spend money, basically just as the price to continue to exist in quarantine. And that's actually one of the biggest gripes by people in China against the government, which is that these lockdowns just destroy their finances. Like you've got all these expenses that you have to pay for, but suddenly you just get cut off from all of your income like overnight. So the government has gone out of its way over the past couple months in particular to try to alleviate some of the pressure in that vein. In that vein, they tried to, pressure employers not to be quite so draconian and to try to, help workers pay for, fixed expenses that they can't really change while they're in lockdown and whatnot. But even so, you know, rule of law is not really a thing in China. So of course, even if the government wants employers to do that, probably a lot of them are not. And there's probably not a lot the government can do about it because if you're in business in China, you've got connections, most likely, at the very least, with local government officials. So those local government officials get a cut of the business, whenever it makes money. So there's not really an incentive to crack down on them for not following various rules and laws and whatnot. And they're going to prioritize the interests of their partners over labor. You know, ironic given that supposed to be a communist system, but Chinese political culture has pretty much transcended and defeated every attempt by modernizers of every stripe, including communists, to tame it. So, government corruption is kind of a long-running theme in Chinese history, you might say. So no surprise that it's still a problem. But the party has not done itself any favors in trying to deal with that. So it's unlikely, I think, that the government is really going to be able to ensure and protect workers fully, given just how free the hand of local authorities is and how little incentive they have to actually do that. So anyway, long story short, migrant workers hate lockdowns more than anybody, to the point where a lot of them have actually stopped migrating. There's actually labor shortages in China right now, not so much because of the demographic issue. Of course, China's population is famously falling, or is at least supposed to start falling soon, depending on who you believe. There's some question about the demographic data there. Government data is not entirely trustworthy in China. That's a whole other conversation. But it's not just about demographics. It's also about the fact that workers are so concerned about lockdowns that they would rather just stay home and make less money than travel to the cities and manufacturing centers and make more money, but maybe be at the risk of losing a whole shit ton of money because of a lockdown. So that cutoff, well, not cutoff, there are still some people migrating, but that curtailment in the supply of migrant labor has been particularly impactful. And it's actually one of the forces that's inhibiting Chinese GDP growth, as well as just output in general in the Chinese economy. So that's a real thing. Now, that said, I'm just kind of reviewing all of this to give you the background here. Like, people in China are just done with lockdowns. They have no further patience for them. Like, they're just really upset about it. And then, I think it was last Sunday or Saturday, there was a fire in Urumqi, which is the capital city of Xinjiang. I think everybody knows about Xinjiang at this point. That's the western province of China that has the ethnic minority, the Uyghurs, that have kind of been rounded up and put in camps and whatnot. That's its own conversation. But putting that aside for a moment, in Urumqi, there was an apartment building that burned down. And in China, like apartment building means residential tower. I think this was kind of a smaller residential tower, but decent sized building, with just residents living there. And it burned down. And when it did, people online started saying that the government was responsible, and specifically Zero COVID was responsible for the deaths, of which there were about 10, because they had blockaded the entrances and exits to the building.
Yikes.
Yeah. Now, that has actually not really been confirmed since then. Nobody's been able to prove it one way or the other. And the government, of course, has come out and said, "You'll know it's not zero COVID. It was just a fire. It was an accident, etc." But nobody believed the government. Everybody believed the rumor instead. And that rumor spread like wildfire. And the immediate effect, like the next day, was unprecedented urban protests. So it wasn't just like a few small protests, like protesting against local government corruption. Like there's thousands of protests like that that happen in China every year. To go on a little tangent, some people have the mistaken impression that China, being an authoritarian police state, does not allow any protests. That's not actually true. They actually do give people some leeway to protest, so long as they're protesting in the right way and against the right people. So, you can't be violent, you can't try to attack police or anything. And you can't blame the national government. You can't say that this is the fault of the Communist Party, we need a new government. That's not allowed. What you can do is peacefully protest and or petition and blame local corruption and ask the Communist Party to deal with it. That's sort of within the acceptable bounds. That's the kind of protest that China watchers are more used to. This is not what was happening last week. Last week people hit the streets. It was not like millions of people per se, but it was hundreds of people, maybe thousands in some cases in some cities. And it was only in like a handful of cities, not everywhere. But still, the fact that it happened in probably over a dozen large urban centers and were highly visible. Like there were foreign journalists like running around with them and taking pictures and video and stuff, and people even within China were sharing video of it. And so very brazen, but the most shocking thing of all was that people were openly criticizing and denouncing the national government. That's very dangerous in China, and it's not something you see like ever. That's very rare. Like the week before that, like the week before all this shit went down, at the opening of the National People's Conference, when Xi Jinping basically cemented his next term, for the next 5 or 10 years or whatever, there was actually a guy in Beijing who put up a sign on a bridge denouncing the government, denouncing zero COVID, and asking for change. Now, obviously, that sign and that protester did not last very long. The police were pretty quick to do that, but the fact that he did it at all was pretty shocking. And so that made the rounds on China's internet. So it wasn't thought that that would necessarily go anywhere. It was thought to be an isolated incident. But then we got the protests last week, and it became quickly apparent that that was not an isolated incident. That was representative of the deep discontent in China over zero COVID. Now, to give you an idea of what some of the protests were going on about, there were people chanting, like full on chanting, Xi Jinping stand down. Very, very dangerous. Like, that's a big deal in China. That's not something that people have seen openly done in public by a large group of people probably since 1989. Now, the protests only really lasted for a night. There were some people who tried the next day, but by then the police had started the crackdown, basically. On the first night, the police were kind of lenient. They kind of let people go, air their grievances a little bit. But then the next night, they tried to flood areas where they thought that protesters were trying to organize protests. And they also started arresting people that they believed had participated in the protests. Maybe not all of them, but there were reports that people were starting to get arrested. And then there was also harassing phone calls, people getting calls from the local police saying, hey, where were you the other night? Obviously they knew where they were. They were just trying to intimidate them. And then they would also call parents of protesters and tell their parents to tell their children to stop spreading malicious rumors and, stuff like that. So there really hasn't been any big demonstrations since then. There was a couple, I think, in Guangzhou afterwards, but otherwise nothing nearly as big or seemingly coordinated. And the aftermath has been that the Chinese government has announced that they're going to start easing up on zero COVID. They haven't said they're doing it in response to the protests, but in the days afterward, the government did come out. Well, more specifically, local governments in China started coming out and saying that they were going to relax various restrictions of one kind or another. So it seems like they did have an impact. Certainly it was just unprecedented in scale and brazenness. So I think the party got the message and they're starting to make adjustments, which is the smart thing to do in this case. There's no reason to pick a fight here. This is zero COVID is immensely unpopular, and the government, while it has the power probably to intimidate people into complying with it, it just doesn't benefit them at all. There's no upside to it. So overall, I think the protesters are probably going to get their way. Although I think some of the bolder protesters are probably not. The guys asking for Xi Jinping to step down, or certainly the guys that were asking for the Communist Party to step down, that was probably a bridge too far. Those people are probably in trouble. But hey, full credit where credit is due. It was a brave thing to do. So good on them for that much, at least. But yeah, that's what you missed the last week. That was a big deal.
That sounds highly unprecedented.
It was. And I have, what was it? I think I had some video. Here, I can try to get some links so that I could share them with you. Let me send those to you. There's one, and then I had a couple others. Here we go.
People are saying they saw videos where they're welding doors of an apartment building shut. Another one with a
Yeah.
door with steel rods placed in front of the door so they couldn't be opened.
Yep.
Jeez
That's
Louise.
that's how that's when they really want to quarantine a building, that's what they do.
That
And they
is
just keep you trapped inside. There's nothing you can do about it.
that is some apocalyptic shit. Damn.
Yeah, people in China didn't like it. They put up with it in 2020, they got tired of it in 21, and now in 2022, they're openly challenging the government over it. And again, given that it's an authoritarian police state, that really just gives you an idea of just how much people in China are sick of it.
Yeah, chat's asking, did they deliver food by helicopter or what? Or are you just hungry?
So what'll happen is that sometimes they'll leave like a single entrance. That'll be like the bottleneck, and then they'll have health officials bring in food to you. Basically your rations. And depending on the locality, they may have looser rules where delivery men are allowed to bring you stuff, and they can kind of just bring it to the front of the building, or maybe even to your door, depending on how liberal the restrictions are. Again, China is such a big country and it's so multifaceted that there's not really any one uniform way to do stuff. Local governments almost always have their own interpretations of national mandates. Um, they often use them for corrupt purposes. They'll say that this, that, or the other national mandate was insufficiently specific, and then they'll go off and do some obviously corrupt bullshit and try to justify it in those terms. But yeah, you can always find local governments doing things differently in one part of the country than another. That's not unusual.
Mm.
But yeah, like there's definitely places that do it really dumb and just do it like overly restrictive. They're just absolutely hardcore about making sure that nobody leaves, even if it means they, starve to death or something. And then in other areas, it's super light touch. But the problem is that, the bad examples of zero COVID have grown in frequency and grown in public prominence, you might say. There's been more and more reporting about them, that people are more and more tired, more and more exasperated by the continuation of zero COVID. And that just kind of builds on, the general anxiety and exhaustion of having to do things like daily testing. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but in a lot of places in China, where there are, for example, outbreaks of COVID-19, but even in areas where it's just thought that there might be, you have a daily testing requirement. So you'll have to go out, get a PCR test, and then if you test negative, then it's recorded. If you test positive, you're just immediately, carted off to quarantine. And it actually gets even more interesting when you consider the application, a smartphone application developed by the government to keep track of everybody's COVID status. So the idea here is that you have to install this app on your phone, in which the government basically tracks your whereabouts. Like whenever you enter a store or something, you're supposed to check the app, kind of scan the QR code with the location of the building and whatnot. Generally stores and buildings and whatnot have these QR codes available specifically for this purpose. So you scan the QR code, and then the government application records where you were and when you were there. And they do that to facilitate back tracing. So if somebody who is in the location, well, if anybody tests positive for COVID, what they can do is they can look at their phone and they can look at all of the places they were and what time they were there, and then they can correlate that with data from everybody else's smartphone and find everybody else who had been in that place at that same time, and then quarantine them as well. So this is very intrusive system, as you can imagine. It probably wouldn't fly here in the United States. But in China, it's just normal. Like this is a normal backtracing application, and pretty much everybody has it. But it actually gets even more complicated when you consider that it's possible for the government to basically just hit a switch and change the designation in your app. What I mean by that is that everybody basically has a ranking. It's not even a ranking. It's like green and red. And maybe there's a third one, I don't know. But I think at the very least, uh, you have to have a green code basically in this application in order to just freely travel. You still have to get regularly tested. If you're not regularly tested, then I think they change it to red, and then you're kind of fucked. But so long as you do the daily testing and whatnot, it stays green and you're okay. But what can happen, obviously if you have COVID, it changes to red and then you get quarantined. But it can change to red really unpredictably, and that's the issue. Like you can be in the middle of a business trip, you can be on the train, and then all of a sudden your app will change your designation to red. And generally that happens because of the back tracing that I mentioned. You were probably associated, whatever, with somebody else who tested positive. You were probably at some point in the same place at the same time as them. But the government doesn't give you any forewarning. And as soon as it turns to red, then immediately all of those restrictions start applying. So, if you're traveling, you won't be able to get off your train, you won't be able to get off your plane, and local authorities will just cart you off somewhere. And then you're just kind of on your own. And it can be very disruptive if you're not prepared for it. So it's not just the sort of dystopian intrusiveness of the application. That's the issue. People in China are kind of used to that at this point. That's not necessarily surprising. The bigger problem is the randomness of it, just the unpredictability of just being suddenly interrupted in your daily life and just taken away. Like that's very problematic if you're just trying to get by and survive day to day.
That's kidnapping.
Well, it's not kidnapping if it's legal.
That's weird that
It's
that's legal kidnapping.
Yeah, well, they don't want COVID-19 to spread. So of course, in the minds of government officials, then it's justified to just kind of pick you up and say, "Oh, hey, your rating changed to red on your application, so time to go. You're in quarantine now." So that gives you an idea of just, the broader context here of why people are so upset about the zero COVID and whatnot, and why they've kind of gone to bat recently. Now, there was some lead up to this, just to kind of add more background here. This was also in my notes here. Two things. Had you heard about the protests in Zhengzhou?
No.
So Zhengzhou is the capital of Henan province. I apologize for butchering the pronunciation. I know my Chinese is awful. But Zhengzhou is a very large city in its own right. I think it's like top 20 or so in China. It's the capital of Henan, which is, not one of the more wealthy provinces. It's kind of more interior. But the point here is that one of the leading employers in Zhengzhou is Foxconn. I'm sure people remember them from stories about their workers and factories in Taiwan committing suicide because of the working conditions. Well, they also have a plant in Zhengzhou. And the Zhengzhou plant actually contracts with Apple. And what they make for Apple is iPhones. They assemble them there. And apparently this plant, this factory, is actually more of a complex, a factory complex. And they make at this complex, from what I read, it was something like 80% of all the world's annual production of smartphones. Well, no, not smartphone, Apple phones, iPhones specifically. So they make basically every year a huge chunk of Apple's annual production of iPhones. And in order to do that, this complex employs, from what I read, 200,000 people. Just a massive number. Now, the reason this was in the news recently is because there was, as you might guess, a lockdown in Zhengzhou. And that, of course, created a lot of waves in Apple's supply chain. But more importantly for the conversation we're having now, that 200,000 people were immediately quarantined in the factory complex. Right? The government and the factory didn't want people to just be stuck in quarantine not working, so they reach some kind of agreement where people would be quarantined in the factory so that they could continue to work. But of course, there was a problem. And the problem was that the government, and presumably also Foxconn, did not sufficiently supply people with enough food, water, and other stuff that was needed. That had been one of the conditions of the agreement. We'll let you stay in the factory instead of forcing you to stay at home. And if you agree to do that, in exchange, we'll give you everything that you need so that you don't have to worry about anything. Well, that didn't work out. That ended up pissing off 200,000 very angry factory workers in Zhengzhou. And the result is that the factory workers just went completely apeshit. So this was actually the week before the big protests this past week that happened because of zero COVID. The Zhengzhou protests saw mass protests, because again, we're talking like 200,000 people. And when I say protest, I don't really mean protest. I mean, it was really more like a riot. Like there's footage of these workers full on fist fighting with health workers and security workers. And because the government knew it was going to be like a huge job to quarantine all these people and to make sure they didn't leave, they had a huge number of government health workers and security workers at the complex. But it wasn't enough. The factory workers just like full on rushed them. And a lot of them just picked up and left. They just said, hey, screw your quarantine, I'm going home. And they went back to their home province. And at this point, the supply chain for Apple is actually even more screwed than it already was. Because now, in addition to the disruption caused by the lockdown, now there's a labor shortage in the factory complex because so many people broke quarantine, again, violently, that the factory just doesn't have enough people to meet its production quota, to meet its contracted production amount. So that was kind of the first sign that something was happening in China. Like even before the Urumqi fire kind of catalyzed the broader protests, the Zhengzhou factory protest really illustrated that people were fed up and that the government was going to face problems. It's bad enough when people protest, but when people are sufficiently fed up that they're just actively like fist fighting government officials, that's a whole nother level of fucked, especially if you're an authoritarian political system. So that was a big red flag for them. Now, the other item I had here regarded the World Cup. So the World Cup is a big deal. It's been going on. If you care about the sports, that's probably, one of your big things. Most of the people listening are probably from the United States, and the US doesn't really care that much about it. It's just kind of a thing happening. But in the rest of the world, it's a big deal. It's the big deal right now. That doesn't, it's the biggest big deal that doesn't involve violence or instability. Let's put it like that. Now, people in China are just as much fans of the World Cup and FIFA as, people pretty much anywhere. And the government knows that, so they've been broadcasting the games and whatnot to try to keep people entertained. Now, the issue is that in the rest of the world, pretty much nobody, hardly any other country, is doing any kind of zero COVID approach to COVID-19. And that includes at the World Cup. So at the World Cup, you can see shit tons of people in the stadium who are very obviously not social distancing, right? What is it, like one llama's distance between you and the other person? None of that. Like it's a stadium at full capacity. People are just arm to arm, jammed in together, no social distancing. And a lot of those people, easily the vast majority, not wearing any kinds of masks or anything. So that's not shocking to us because we're just kind of used to that. We're not really in a post-pandemic situation yet, but in the minds of the public and the vast majority of the world, we're effectively in a kind of post-pandemic situation. But in China, they're not. The government is still doing zero COVID. And so when people see on the World Cup presentation on TV that there's all these, shit tons of people just out in public living their lives like normal, like it was before the pandemic, a lot of people on China's internet got a little wistful about that. And the Chinese government had not anticipated that. When you do like a World Cup broadcast, like it's normal to show footage of like the crowd, one team scores a goal, the crowd goes wild, you show people out in the crowd. But after the first couple of days, the government realized that this is actually really bad PR for the government's own zero COVID policy. So they made a change and they started only showing players and coaches. That was the change they made. Instead of showing whenever something happened, the reaction of the crowd, they just cut the crowd out completely. And they only showed the game, the players' reactions, and the coaches' reactions. And it was immediately noticed on China's internet. Like it was just painfully obvious to everybody what the government was doing and why they had done it. So that's another example of how fed up people were with zero COVID. Like the government is conscious of it, and the rest of the world kind of serves as a reminder that there is something to be conscious about, that there is a kind of another way to be dealing with the problem. So basically, the esteem held in China's government, among the Chinese people anyway, has fallen very, very far at this point from the heyday of 2020, right? 2020 was all about containing COVID-19 and wolf warrior diplomacy and fisticuffs, with the Trump administration. Like it was kind of heady days for Beijing. But since then, they've lost almost all of that goodwill. They've just blown it, like both internationally and domestically. The party has just backed itself into an absolute corner and does not know how to get out. And it's worth mentioning here that the government is not entirely wrong about zero COVID. The stupidity, the capricious nature of zero COVID enforcement, like all of that stuff can be fixed. That's all bad unto itself. But one of the underlying reasons the Chinese government still has zero COVID is because one, there's actually a very low vaccination rate in China. China developed its own COVID-19 vaccines, but people are really skeptical about them. And because people are skeptical about them, they haven't really been taking them, especially older folks, which are the people most in danger. Those are the ones most vulnerable to COVID-19. So that's one problem. Also, China's health infrastructure, not great. Like it's decent and it's definitely better in the more developed parts of the country. But most parts of China are still developing, basically. Not every part of China is like Beijing or Shanghai or, Guangdong province or something. Most of them have relatively limited resources, especially in terms of public services. So one of the concerns is that if there is a big outbreak, then China's hospitals would be overwhelmed. Kind of like what they were in Italy, for example, when COVID-19 first spread there. Italy kind of scared everybody in Europe, in North America. Before then, we'd kind of seen the images coming out of China and Wuhan. But nobody really thought, oh, well, it'll probably just stay in China. And then it spread to Italy, and Italy was overwhelmed, and everybody started freaking out. China was able to contain the stuff in Wuhan, for the most part. But if there were a broader outbreak that kind of looked more like Italy or the U.S. for that matter at the height of the pandemic, they would actually have fewer health resources to deal with that with. Just in terms of hospital capacity, the ability to treat people, that kind of thing. They just don't have that. So if a lot of people got sick, a lot of people would die, more so proportionately than we saw in other countries, just because of the lack of that public infrastructure, the public health infrastructure, rather, more specifically. And again, given the lack of vaccination amongst the most vulnerable part of the population, that would be even worse, because not only would you have people unable to get attention from doctors or receive access to health care or health attention in general because of the lack of overall public health infrastructure, you would also see a lot of the elderly population dying, much higher relative to the total population in China than you saw in other places, because older folks are, one, a larger proportion of China's population anyway because of demographic aging, but also more specifically because of the lack of vaccination. A lot of older people would get sick and probably a pretty decent chunk of them would die. So the death toll would be significant. Not necessarily significant enough to like overturn the government or just up in China, but the government would no longer be able to claim that it had been able to manage the pandemic so much better than other countries that it was able to avoid a significant death toll. Like it would be obvious to everybody that it was probably inevitable all along. But of course, that's a third problem for the government, because if it was inevitable all along, what was the point of the 3 years of zero COVID? So if it becomes inevitable, then that means that the 3 years of lockdowns were mostly for nothing. And, if the government's right, they still look bad. Like if it's true that, just shit tons of people would die if there were a big outbreak that they weren't able to contain with zero COVID policies, then the question becomes, well, why didn't the government prepare for it? Like if it was inevitable that there would be an outbreak, uh, regardless of zero COVID, then why didn't the government vaccinate more people? Why didn't it build up the health infrastructure more? Why was there not more preparation for this? And of course, the answer is that the government is one, corrupt, two, it didn't think it needed to, and three, it kind of was hoping that it would just kind of get by on zero COVID semi-permanently. And none of those are very satisfying answers to that question, if you're Chinese. So regardless of how you look at it, the Chinese government has screwed this up. They didn't sufficiently prepare for opening, and they've also just insufficiently implemented their zero COVID stuff in a way that is not capricious, at least not, sufficiently benign as to prevent, just shit tons of people from actively hating it to the point where they're willing to come out and openly criticize the government. So they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. And so, yeah, it's turned out that 2020 was kind of a little bubble for China in that sense, and the Chinese government more specifically. They only, it seems, delayed the inevitable. Maybe if they can vaccinate a lot of the people, then they can avoid a massive damaging outbreak. But for now, given the lack of trust in China's society towards the government, mistrust that actually existed well before the pandemic, I would add, but which was only made worse because there's endemic conspiracy theories in China about the government, specifically government officials, making money off of PCR tests and zero COVID generally. Basically, they think that one of the reasons zero COVID has gone on as long as it has is because government officials are getting rich off of it. So that, of course, just feeds into the general criticism of zero COVID and undermines the government's legitimacy. So with mistrust at that level, the likelihood that the government can just come out and say, "Hey, you guys need to get vaccinated," no. It's going to be like in the United States when people were super skeptical of the vaccines at the height of the pandemic here, right? There just wasn't anything you could say to them to convince them. So that's actually very similar to the situation in China. And if there's a big outbreak, then that's it. They won't be able to stop it. And given that the virus is becoming more contagious with time, it probably was inevitable that it would reach a point where it was just so contagious that no amount of zero COVID could realistically stop it. So really, that's, an extra factor there. That's kind of going against the Chinese government in that regard.
Yeah, one of the things that we talked about with Will Blur, who's the immunologist, was the notion that the more lethal a virus is, the more difficult it is for it to spread. So there's a natural incentive for any virus to try to be as non-lethal as possible so you can infect as many hosts as possible. So zero COVID as a initial response when the virus was potentially the most deadly has like the highest chance of being feasible, but as it gets basically selected out into weaker and weaker versions, zero COVID becomes less and less feasible. And also the collective patience of people is going down. Like they're tired of it, and it does cost them energy to say, okay, I actually won't go outside and do anything because I'm doing this for the greater good. At some point they're like, okay, when is the point where we're done with this, or is there one?
Yeah, exactly. Like there's no relief on the horizon, or at least they hadn't been until the past week.
Mm-hmm.
You know. But again, even with the announcements of the relaxations at the local level, it's still not entirely clear if they'll be able to completely abandon it out of fear of a general outbreak, which could end up being just as damaging to the government's credibility.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Again, damned if they do, damned if they don't. Like there's no escaping a negative outcome at this point for the Chinese government, at least as far as COVID-19. So yeah, we'll see what the Chinese people do about that. Maybe the government's efforts to placate them will be sufficient. We'll see. But it was definitely a notable week. Yeah, all eyes were on China. Yeah, definitely check out some of those videos. It's pretty wild stuff.
Imagining that kind of situation for people in the US is, yeah, that would never fly. People get a lot more upset about a lot lower levels of restrictions here.
Oh, yeah. Let's see. That's about all I had on China. I did have an extra note here that was just sort of extra, but basically, I was noting that the city of Zhengzhou has been very eventful the past couple of years. So, do you remember that mass flooding in China where the people on the subway were caught in it and the flooding like went up to their necks and they were just stuck on the train?
Mm-hmm.
That was Zhengzhou.
Mm.
That was the same city. And I think we talked about it earlier this year. Do you remember when there was protests in China regarding the mortgage payments? People were protesting because the stuff that they'd taken out mortgage payments for wasn't getting built. And so they went out and protested en masse in front of a bank. Do
Mm-hmm.
you remember that at all?
I don't think I saw that one.
Well, that was also Zhengzhou.
They've had it rough there.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that they've had it rougher than in other places, but I think just because the flooding was particularly bad there and because they had the abnormally large Foxconn plant, they've just kind of ended up being the locus for an unusual number of these sort of big events.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you're right, though, that Zhengzhou has definitely been unusually active, certainly in the news as far as Chinese cities go. I don't know if there's anybody who speaks Chinese in chat, but my question to you would be, is it pronounced Zhengzhou or Zhengzhou? I kind of go between them without thinking about it, but I imagine there must be like one of them which is the correct one.
Number one, Zhongzhou. Number two, Zhongzhou.
Thank you.
Chad is saying the second one, Zhongzhou.
Zhengzhou. Okay. Thank you. I'll try to keep that in mind. Zhengzhou. Yeah, that OU at the end always throws me. I see that and my brain immediately wants to say Zhengzhou, but I've heard Zhengzhou before, so I
Mm-hmm.
knew that was a possibility. So apparently that is correct. So thank you for the correction. I didn't do the usual disclaimer. I should do that now. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. More painfully obvious at some times than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while I do this, but I will read it later, so I will see the feedback, eventually. And I do appreciate the feedback we get on here. I like listening to the people kind of commenting and arguing with each other sometimes in chat. It's always a very informative experience. So thank you for participating in our little segment here. It's always appreciated.
Yep, and it's meant to be interactive too. Sometimes we do corrections and that kind of a thing. So if we mess anything up, it's not like we want to keep it that way. If you have information that we don't, please do share. There was someone earlier who said, these guys don't know anything about Europe. And it was like, okay, sure. If you want to give some feedback or correct anything we said wrong or give us information we don't have, feel free. And they didn't say anything else. So hot takes
Yeah,
in the
that's
chat.
always frustrating. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, either he's wrong and he's just kind of, pontificating, or he's right and I'm still making an ass out of myself. Neither is particularly attractive an option. So,
Mm.
if I'm just talking shit, tell me, because I don't mean to on here. I try to inform people and share information so that people can kind of look at things from, a stronger perspective,
Mm-hmm.
with a more informed perspective. So if I'm getting something wrong, I'm not kidding when I say I want to know more than anybody. I do. I'm trying to give a relatively objective presentation. So criticism is appreciated in so much as I fail to do that. Well, let's see it. We kind of really blew through this one, didn't we?
Yeah, well, the China one was a big item that people had been buzzing about a lot, and Ukraine always takes up a pretty decent chunk of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, Ukraine always tempts me with tangents because that ties into military history and stuff.
Yeah.
Probably takes longer than it should. Well, I would add here, what, we've got 20 minutes thereabouts?
Yeah.
See, well, I was going to add that the Kurds have been kind of getting roughed up the past couple weeks. Have you heard about that?
No, by Turkey.
By Turkey and Iran, actually. It's not clear if they're coordinating at all, but both Iran and Turkey have been launching airstrikes into Kurdish territories in northern Syria and northern Iraq. They're kind of doing so for their own reasons. In Iran's case, it's obviously due to the mass protests that have broken out, which have predominantly been concentrated in the northwestern territories
Mm-hmm.
of Iran, which are predominantly Kurdish. Well, Kurdish and Azeri, but Kurds are the relevant ethnicity here. And in Turkey's case, there was a big suicide bombing in Istanbul a couple weeks ago,
Mm-hmm.
killed a bunch of people. And the government has been kind of cagey about just who was responsible. They immediately pointed the finger at the PKK, which is a radical Kurdish separatist group that they've kind of been fighting with, and which has a history of terrorist activity. But then it was kind of noted online that the woman that they'd implicated didn't really seem to have much history of radicalism. So there's some suspicion that the Turkish government may have just picked somebody out to kind of take the fall and give them an excuse to go after the Kurds. I've kind of said it before, several episodes in a row now, but there's an election in Turkey next year. So everybody in Turkey, at least in Turkish politics, is acting a little squirrely because the AKP is feeling a little bit weak. The AKP is the party in power. They're the incumbent right now. So they're feeling a little weak. They're not as popular as they used to be. So they've kind of been going out of their way to try to shore up support, especially amongst ultra nationalists. The biggest and most important group in Turkish politics is nationalists. As far as the spectrum of Turkish politics goes, you've got nationalists on one side and then ultra nationalists on the other, and that's about it. You don't have a whole lot of others to work with. So it's important to make sure that you look good in front of the nationalists. And that generally manifests as various kinds of grandstanding with countries and groups that fancy, well, that the Turks themselves fancy to be their rivals. In the case of the Mediterranean, that frequently manifests as saber rattling over disputed islands and territory, specifically disputed with Greece and Cyprus. But in places like the Middle East, sometimes they go further than that and take the opportunity to launch some airstrikes or, kill some people that they accuse of being Kurdish radicals of one sort or another. It's the kind of thing that ultranationalists really like and appreciate, as bizarre as that may sound. But yeah, in response to that suicide bombing, the Turkish government opened up on Kurds in Syria and Iraq, went after them. In the case of Iraq, it's not the regional government. There's two big political parties in northern Iraq. I think it's the KDP and the PUK, and both of them are relatively moderate. And they're not super involved in like separatist activity in Turkey or anything. But just across the border from Turkey into Iraq, in the Kurdish territory, there actually are some PKK radicals that have set up base and have been operating. So the airstrikes that have been happening more in that area. Although sometimes they do venture out if they're trying to go after somebody in particular who maybe isn't located near the border. Syria pretty much speaks for itself. There's obviously a lot of Kurdish militias there under the rubric of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is supported by the United States. That's kind of sort of our proxy, although I wonder if we aren't more the proxy of the Kurds in that case. Syrian policy and US foreign policy is kind of a mess, so it's never entirely clear just what American objectives are there. But regardless, some Kurds end up kind of putting themselves in a position where the US kind of has to distance themselves from them. Normally the US is very protective of the Kurds in Syria, but some of the groups and areas outside of SDF control kind of do their own thing. And every so often they'll get into big fights with some of the other factions, the Syrian government or the Turks. So it's more those outsider Kurdish groups that kind of have come under fire from the Turks in northern Syria recently. But regardless, if you're Kurdish and you live in northern Iraq or especially northern Syria, you've been getting a lot of bombs dropped on you lately. Both Iran and Turkey find it advantageous to do so. Normally, they don't really cooperate at all. Uh, but it seems that they have something here to cooperate on. Again, not clear that they are cooperating, but at the very least, they're both bombing at the same time. So I'm sure if you're Kurdish, it definitely feels like they're cooperating. I had an added note on this regarding NATO. So obviously, the United States doesn't like, Turkey bombing Kurds. Generally, the Kurds are kind of more aligned with the U.S. in Syria, if not in the Middle East generally. But one of the things that Turkey really wants to do is to launch a land incursion. They want to send ground forces into Syria. And for several weeks now, there's been rumors that the Turks are preparing to do exactly that. Now, of course, the United States is probably going to tell them, no, we don't want you to do that. But one of the things going on in European politics and within NATO is the accession of Finland and Sweden. So Turkey is still stonewalling on approving Swedish and Finnish membership into NATO. And so it could be that I guess he's president now, President Erdogan. It could be that President Erdogan is going to use Finland and Sweden as a negotiating chip in order to get some kind of American agreement to allow a Turkish incursion into Syria. Maybe it's just a limited incursion, maybe it's even just a symbolic one, but I kind of suspect that Erdogan, being a transactional politician, is going to try to get some kind of transaction there in exchange for Turkish support to Finnish and Swedish accession. So that's something to kind of keep an eye on. We might have to trade some Kurdish lives in order to get Sweden and Finland into NATO, which is an eminently unpalatable choice to make, but it's also one that we may have no choice but to make. It remains to be seen. Even if Turkey did agree to allow them in, that still leaves Hungary, which is still also stonewalling. I have no idea what kind of bullshit they're asking for.
So it has to be a unanimous decision to.
Yes,
Damn,
it
that's
does.
hardcore.
Yeah, and it's gotten harder too as the alliance has grown in size. I think they're up to what, 20 to 30 members. That's tough. At the beginning, it was like a dozen, maybe, probably not even that. There's like the three low countries. Was it France? That's four, five, six, seven, and then eight for Norway, nine for Denmark. So yeah, about a dozen in the beginning. Much easier to work with. And of course, Hungary takes the opportunity to kind of needle the West at this point. I guess they're technically part of the West, but they don't. The government doesn't really act like it these days. But anyway, some excitement in the Middle East. I thought it was worth commenting on, just in case it leads to something more later on, as far as like Turkish incursions and NATO membership for Finland and Sweden.
Mm.
Oh, and the crackdown in Iran started.
Oh,
Did
after
you
all
hear about
those
that?
protests? No, I have not.
Yeah, the protests have been going on a while. The government has kind of been roughing them up, arresting them. But the crackdown did not really start until a couple weeks ago. And that was when they finally sent in the Revolutionary Guard Corps to start trying to suppress the protests in certain cities in the Northwest. So now they've kind of really gone after them, and there's been reports of protesters being fired upon, being killed in the street. It's gotten a lot, the violence has definitely ramped up at this point, to the point where a lot of Iranians were even just shitting on their own team in the World Cup because they were so mad at the government. It's not entirely fair, I mean, if you're a player on the soccer team, on the national whatever team, you don't have a lot of choices, right? If you come out explicitly in favor of the protest, the government's gonna recall you and punish you effectively. So there's not so much, there was only so much that they could have done. And to be fair, the male team, the men's national team, which I guess is the only team in the World Cup, they did refuse to sing Iran's national anthem during the opening of, I think, their first game or whatever it was. So that was done in support of the protests. And that was a risky move. So, you got to give them that.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of pro-protest people in Iran are not willing to kind of extend them that courtesy. For them, all they see is a representation of the nation on a national stage. And they see also their opponents, the people trying to crack down on them and kill them, cheering on the team. So anything that upsets their enemies is a good thing.
Mm.
So if the Iran World Cup team loses, that was worth celebrating. And they did end up losing. They actually lost to Great Britain and the US, actually. Well, no, not to the US. Actually, that was a scoreless draw. But they did lose to the UK, I think. So I think that was also somewhat embarrassing given the historical context there. So a lot of the protesters and pro-protest people in Iran were very happy with that outcome, much to the chagrin of the nationalists in Iran.
That's one of the weird things that ends up being on the table for sporting events is the current political climate and what the various countries are doing, because these are athletes that don't have much of a say in their government at all, but they act as representatives in a sense where people can source their discontent and so on. I have seen a lot of stuff of like people being mad that it was hosted in Qatar.
Oh, yeah. I don't know why. FIFA is not a humanitarian organization. It's really much more known for corruption at this point than anything. So it's not really all that surprising
Agent
in
Smith's
the
take,
grand
don't
scheme
they
of
know that
things.
FIFA is evil? Of course they're going to put it in Qatar.
It's not so much that they're evil, it's just that they're very, very, I guess I can be diplomatic here and say that they're practical. Like, it's not the job of FIFA to come out and criticize governments for this, that, or the other from their perspective. It's just about the football, you know.
That
And
sounds
so
like
they try
something
to,
the Empire from Star Wars would say. I'm just saying. We're not evil, we're just practical. Oh, okay.
yeah, that's pretty much the counter argument there. So yeah, I don't think a lot of people really buy FIFA's line on that, but totally predictable. It's pretty much exactly what I was expecting. There was one thing though, kind of getting a little off on a tangent, but there was one guy sort of near the opening of the games or the game or whatever the phrasing is. Uh, there was a guy, I think he was the lead official responsible for organizing the World Cup in Qatar. And there was a press conference, and the journalists. This was after all the criticism online and on news sites and stuff about Qatar, its human rights record, and whether or not FIFA had really done the right thing, etc. And so the journalists kind of, well, at first they didn't say anything because it was actually just supposed to be a short statement announcing the opening of the World Cup. So nobody was really expecting anything. And this guy proceeded to start talking about how actually it's not that big a deal that FIFA is hosting the World Cup or that Qatar is hosting the World Cup. And at first, he gave the initial comments about the start of the World Cup, and then he talked about how it wasn't that bad a thing. And then he kept talking, and then he kept talking, and it turned into this hour-long screed criticizing people who had been criticizing Qatar and its human rights record. And the journalists who were present kind of later on talked about how surprised they were and how random it was. Because, like, normally FIFA doesn't really get that deep into these kinds of issues. And then here's this guy, and he's just going, like, all in on defending Qatar, like full-throated defense of Qatar, its record, the hosting of the World Cup, like the whole thing. And it just caught everybody off guard.
Is this the
Because
guy who
normally,
was saying like the today I am gay, today I'm whatever?
that's the guy.
That guy. Yeah, that was really weird.
That was indeed
Like, why is he
very
going to
weird.
bat so hard for Qatar? He didn't have to
That
do that.
that's what surprised people because like normally FIFA just kind of tries to sit on the fence and be inoffensive and otherwise just stay quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Like if people want to complain, let them complain. We don't have to get involved. And then here comes this guy and he just decides to like jump in. Maybe maybe the Qatari government just really felt aggrieved and wanted them to go and defend them or whatever. I don't know. But that's what happened. If they wanted somebody to defend them, that's definitely what they got. I don't think it was a very effective defense. I think it just came off as a little bit rambling for the most part. But he did make an effort, so they got that going for them. Very peculiar. Anyway, I got a bunch of video off of Reddit of the crackdown in Iran, and I sent it to you.
Cool. Thank you, Saya.
Yeah, what was there was one in particular that kind of got me. Where was that? No, not that one. Is it this one? No, not that one. There was one that doesn't actually show anything. It's in I think it was like in one of the northwest. It was in a northwestern city. That was what the poster said it. That was where the poster said the video was taken anyway. And it was just a person like just outside of their house, I guess, or at a corner somewhere. And they were videotaping, but the only thing that you could hear, well, it was more about what you could hear. It was more about the audio than the video. And you could just hear like screaming and gunshots, and it just sounded like the whole city was just in chaos. And and the person filming was like a girl, and you could like hear her crying in the background behind the camera.
Hmm.
And it was just kind of jarring, like I've seen video of like militias mobilizing, guys in technicals. I've seen people fighting in the streets, protests, all that kind of stuff. But, just a video of somebody stepping outside of their home and then hearing people be killed, attacked, just for protesting, that kind of really brings it home in a way, at least for me. So I thought that video in particular was kind of unique and notable in that regard.
Hmm.
It's somewhere in there. I don't remember which one it was. Let's see. How are we doing on time?
Oh, we've got a few more minutes if you want to do some wrap up.
Gosh, there's probably other stuff I'm forgetting here. I'll just scroll through, see if there's. I'm almost certainly forgetting something important. This is what I get for not organizing my notes more. Divine punishment. Oh, yeah, there was an economic report released from the Fed. Apparently, the US economy is still adding jobs, and wages are still going up.
Hmm.
So that's a good sign for the economy. Very bad sign for inflation.
Oh.
That's exactly what we did not want to see. So most likely the Fed is going to continue to crank up interest rates, for one, but it also raises the specter of a reciprocating increase in wages and prices that leads to out of control inflation, which is what economists are the most worried about as far as inflation. So still very early now, still very early stage. It's not like spiraling out of control or anything, but
Hmm.
when inflation starts up, wages generally follow. And that just drives further inflation, which can drive further wage increases, which then results in a cycle of inflation that is very hard to contain. So the Fed is probably going to be worried about that in the data. They would have preferred if wages had moderated somewhat rather than just continuing on. Although there is a different interpretation of that. I did see somebody argue online that actually we're not adding jobs, that it just looks like that because the survey that was used to produce the data uh, counts individual jobs, but not necessarily jobs held by the same person. So if you use the household survey instead, which basically just surveys people and asks them if they're employed and how many jobs they have, then actually a lot of the jobs being gained are actually just people taking on extra jobs, which could reflect inflation really starting to bite. Normally maybe you could afford everything you needed with just one job, but maybe because of inflation now, especially in housing, you have to take on another job or maybe even two jobs. So it could be that all of that job growth is a kind of illusory job growth, and that actually consumers that and actually it might just be a sign that consumers are really hurting right now and struggling to pay for necessities, which could bode for a significant decrease in consumption if the certain threshold is reached beyond which people can no longer add new jobs or borrow more money, then eventually consumption will finally just decrease. And then you'll start seeing declines in wages and also output, and potentially the onset of an economic downturn of some scale. So that is another interpretation out there. I'm a little skeptical about it, but I'd want to look more into the data to kind of see a more nuanced opinion. You know, when it comes to economic data, there's not like any one set of indicators you can use. But from what I've seen, in general, the economy is still doing relatively well. I did read that retail is recovering. Well, no, retail is not recovering. Retail and a couple others basically are struggling, but I kind of attribute that more to people reallocating resources. You know, it's not so much that people are spending less, it's just that they're spending more on necessities. So certain sectors that are not as important are going to see cuts as people kind of cut their spending on stuff that's not essential. So that bodes for a potential decrease later on if the inflationary pressure continues in that vein. But for now, at least, overall spending has been pretty robust despite the inflation, you know, somewhat surprisingly. So overall, the economy seems to be holding up relatively well, all things considered, even if it's really, really hard for people who are working on smaller incomes to get by. A strong economy doesn't mean it's an economy where nobody struggles. There's always going to be people that kind of get hammered disproportionately by changes, be they inflationary or otherwise.
Mm.
So whether or not we spiral into an inflationary dystopia next year or not, something else to look forward to in 2023. It's all part of the exciting 2020s roller coaster.
We live in interesting times.
That we do. That that we do. But it were otherwise.
I'm glad I don't live in China, though, after hearing some stuff that we heard about.
Yeah, China can get a little hairy sometimes, depending on where you live. Certainly, there's lots of interesting historical examples of similar phenomena.
The phone app COVID status stuff feels very like sci-fi dystopian future. That's a thing that I
Yeah.
feel like people were spooked about like 20 years ago, thinking about what phones could do and what the government could track about you. And China's just like writing down these ideas of like, oh yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that.
Hmm. Yep. Yeah, they actually just announced that they're going to start rolling out the social credit score system finally. People have talked a lot about that, but they'd actually not implemented it formally. It was purely in the testing stages.
Are they going to
But
do
I
like an
think
MMR system or are
no, no, I don't think it's going to go that. Actually, from what I was reading about it, it's going to be relatively limited in scope. It's not going to be like this massive society-wide surveillance scoring system, you know. It's going to be more just about keeping track of sort of the periphery, like the worst offenders, basically will have some restrictions placed on them, but it's not going to be something where like speaking out necessarily results in, you know, a certain number of points being knocked off and a certain amount of privileges being taken from you or extra costs being applied in proportion. It's not quite so in depth as that, at least not at this point. Let's see. Did we have any interesting new flags? I think it's the usual suspects pretty much, right?
you could check it out.
Got one from Vietnam. I remember we had a guy from Vietnam a couple years ago who was listening, but I don't know if this is the same guy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, regardless, thank you for listening. Vietnam's been doing pretty well overall. They kind of keep themselves out of the news for the most part, which is for the best, really, given the kinds of things that get countries into the news. What else did we have? Hungary. They're either going to agree with my sentiments about Hungary or they're going to be very angry about them. Doesn't seem like there's a lot of middle ground in Hungary between people who really like or really hate Orban. Kind of seems like it's just one extreme or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Got one from the Netherlands, Chile, Argentina. Oh, was that Dagnip? If
Yes,
so, hello.
Dagnip said that he hasn't responded to your email because he's doing finals right now.
Yeah, it's man, time gets away from me because I remember that over the summer I was talking with Dagnip and well, corresponding with Dagnip and Mass Neotech,
Mm-hmm.
and I kept thinking, oh, I need to get back to them. And I was still kind of in a summer mindset, and then I realized, oh wait, it's the end of fall semester now. Time just completely got away from me. So I apologize. That's on me. Also, I'm trying to read Mass's book recommendation. I actually did get it in Amazon and I keep procrastinating on starting it. So my apologies to Mass if he's out there. Australia's been in the news a bit. They've had a lot of bad weather. And by bad weather, I mean like catastrophic flooding. It's gotten so bad that insurance companies in Australia have started to say that they're just not going to insure homes that are located in flood-prone areas because it's just not cost efficient anymore. They're just not going to do it. So Australia definitely experiencing some of that climate change there to some degree. Canada's been in the news. Canada's been in the news and it's been online and social media. Have you heard about the euthanasia thing?
No.
So there was like a new policy or something in Canada's healthcare system where they're basically allowing publicly assisted suicide
Hmm.
effectively. So, if you're like, if you were in a really bad state and, if you have like a terminal illness or something, then, you can kind of apply for that and they'll do it and help you. But it also extends to other people who maybe do not have terminal illnesses, and that's gotten a lot of criticism from ethicists.
Hmm.
If you want to commit suicide because you're about to die anyway, and the alternative is a really long, drawn out, painful death, there's an ethical argument to be made for euthanasia there. But then if you're just like really depressed and suicidal, and then you come to the Canadian healthcare system and say, "Hey, I want to die. Will you help me do it?" That's much more of a gray area there. That kind of toes the line between uh, ethical euthanasia and just assisted suicide.
Hmm.
Well, I guess it's both assisted suicide, but maybe homicide almost at that point. So some people have been very critical about that.
Yeah, that's one
I'd
of
have to
the
re
larger frontiers of understanding brain science is what depression is, how it works, and how physical and mental health are tied to each other. Because that's one of the things we've been, in a sense, waking up to is the dangers of depression and how even though a person can look physically in good condition, if they do have a mental illness, that's something that is crippling their ability to make decisions and forward progress in their life and that kind of a thing. So definitely one of those newer ways that we're understanding how things can go wrong. And also, our generation has a much greater issue with suicide as opposed to previous generations. And I think part of that is an existential problem for people. Like, we live in a very different world than what was natural for us to kind of be adapted for, like hunter gatherer kind of thing. And then on top of that, basically just the existential dread that a lot of people feel with the overwhelming negative information that we can possibly consume. Like, how we can browse news and stuff is very different from how you could share information on a local level. And then if you're looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a lot of people get stuck with an issue that's higher up the needs chain than just food and shelter. But the brain has a lot of hardware in it to be stressed about something or to be sad about something or depressed about something, and figuring out how to get people out of those mental holes that they can get stuck in is definitely a work in progress.
Well said.
If anyone out there is feeling really down in that sense, getting professional help early is very advisable. Uh, Generally, mental health issues are easier to resolve the earlier you catch them. Kind of like a physical issue, say if you had a tumor or something, the earlier you catch it, the better. And there's no shame in admitting if you have some kind of depression or something like that. I know a lot of people they'll say, "Oh, well, you're just being weak. You just need to be tougher or whatever." But that's an oversimplification, and it's oftentimes dismissing the entire battle that you're fighting internally. So if you need help, get professional help. There are people who understand a lot of these patterns of behavior and patterns of thought, and they can help you get some momentum.
So somebody in chat was saying that this isn't a new thing. So I kind of Googled it. So the law has been on the books since 2016, allowing medical assisted suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's been kind of making the rounds on social media more recently. because those eligible for medically assisted suicide, well, eligibility for medical assisted suicide is set to expand next year, I guess in March. And apparently, some ethicists have been a little critical of the degree to which they're going to expand it. So that's a more detailed review of what the issue is. So it's not new per se, but it is expanding, and it's the expansion that's come in for some criticism.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely something that needs to be thoroughly discussed and talked about. We have a lot of new ethical battles to fight to figure out what the right way forward is when we have new options and new technology.
Oh yeah. Yeah, they got one of those going on in the UK right now. They're trying to pass a law protecting children online, and it's come in for a lot of debate.
Mm-hmm.
They want to make it so that social media has a legal obligation to prevent children from seeing harmful material on social media. But of course, that gets into the weeds of how do you define harmful material? To what extent can the social media companies actually do stuff to prevent it? Age verification has been one item. Should social media firms be required to verify the age of users, and how do you do that? How viable is that? How intrusive is that? Et cetera. So it's a whole debate that they've been kind of going through for a while now. I think the law has been getting debated for more than a year, 2 years, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So new technologies always bring new debates about how to best regulate and use them. So certainly similar issue there.
Mm-hmm. Well, appreciate you coming on and breaking things down for us. Because I'm doing this subathon, I won't be able to publish the VOD for about another 40 hours. Twitch has a 48-hour limit on these streams. So even though my broadcaster software says I've been live for 104 hours, each of them is in a 48-hour chunk. So as soon as that chunk is over, I will publish it. But I'm recording this, so it's going to be shipped to YouTube pretty early. You'll just have to wait basically an extra day and a half to read the chat. But appreciate everyone contributing to the conversation. We do this segment normally on Sundays, ballpark of 6 p.m. No, we do not plan it in advance, so if you ask me on Thursday if we're doing it, I have no idea, but probably yes. But thank you, Agent Smith, for coming on, and thank you, chat, for keeping the conversation fun and lively.
No problem. Always my privilege. Thank you so much for, allowing me to come on here and, comment on this stuff, talk about this stuff, get feedback. It's always a unique thing, to be able to do. And what is this? This is going to be, it's December already, 2022, much to my shock. So that makes this, what is it? 1890, fifth year. This is the fifth year we've been doing this now.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. So, thank you again. Just to reiterate at the end of the fifth year here, how much I appreciate you letting me do this and giving me the opportunity and putting up with me.
Yep, date added oldest. Agent Smith episodes 1 and 2 5 years ago. So you're correct.
Wow. Yeah, that's right. You got them all on there, don't you?
Yep, we have an Agent Smith playlist. Use the Agent Smith command if you want to browse some of the VODs. And the VODs are good even if it's not current news, because some of the time the episode is themed around some history item that's far in the past anyway. So it doesn't matter if you browse it today or in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, we've been hitting current events pretty hard the past year or two just because, 2020s.
Mm-hmm.
We're in this midst of history, so it kind of comes up whether we want it to or not.
Yeah, and we're open to ideas too, because sometimes you'll ask me, like, is there anything that caught your eye? If chat had some historical event that you really want to hear about, that's a fun way to just give us a prompt and thing to talk about for a while. So don't hesitate to do that, even if it's not current news. If it's like some shit that happened in 1875, like maybe there's something to dig into about that, because stuff in the past influences what happens today.
It does add that. For better or worse, it definitely does that.
Yep. Well, I'm going to go get some dinner and give myself a little break. And we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah. See you next time. Thanks again.
GG. Nice.